Interesting figure, given the crisis here in the Labour Party and the rising anti-Semitism. I think the Board of Deputies sort of broke with tradition and took a very sort of active advocacy role in combating or confronting anti-Semitism. So it should be an interesting evening with him. It's going to be 6 and it'll be finished by 7:30 or so you'll have plenty of time for dinner. So Benny will continue his series of lectures this morning. And I think this is his work on this issue and sort of re-examining 1948 or looking at 1948 as jihad, I think is a very, and many scholars think is a very important kind of new take on what happened in Israel in the 1940s and 50s with the establishment of Israel. So, Professor Morris, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Over the past 30 years, I've sort of been looking on and off at the 1948 war, and I wrote several books about the creation of the refugee problem during the war, and eventually in 2008, I published a comprehensive history of the war, military, political. And what I'm going to give you now is essentially the conclusions of that book, which in some ways reassessed the war as compared to previous histories of the war. One of the reasons I spent so much time on the 48 war and energy on writing books is, I suppose, because I was born in 1948, but mainly it's because that's the crucial year in Middle Eastern history, at least in terms of Israel, the Israeli-Arab conflict, the nature of the state of Israel, and in effect, in some ways, the geopolitics of the Middle East in general. It's the most significant of the Israeli-Arab wars. There's been 5, 6, 7, it depends how you count and what you count as a proper war. I say there are 5 wars, some people say 7 or 8, but of the wars, this is was certainly the most historically significant because it planted in the midst of the Arab world, in the middle of the Arab world, and in the middle of the Muslim world, an entity called the Jewish state, Israel, dividing, incidentally, those worlds, the Arab world and the Muslim worlds, into the Eastern and Western Arab worlds, something which Arabs and Muslims perhaps as well, but Arabs certainly found humiliating and in some ways politically damaging. That was one crucial effect of the war, to change the geopolitics of the region. The other, of course, was the collapse or destruction, not destruction, but collapse of Palestinian Arab society in the course of the 48 war, of which the major expression, which is still is lasting, and that's why it's historically significant, was the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, which is still with us, and many consider the chief obstacle to an Israeli-Palestinian peace. I would say it's a major, practical obstacle to reaching a peace. The Palestinians and the Arab world demand the so-called return of the refugees. Israel, of course, opposes such a mass return. So that remains a crucial obstacle. I'll talk more about the refugees in a second. The war erupted in 1947, at the end of 1947, for 2 reasons, you can say, one general reason and one specific reason. The general reason was Zionist immigration to Palestine from the 1880s on, which gradually planted in Palestine a Jewish presence, desirous of a political expression, meaning a Jewish state at the end of the process. And this was growingly resisted in the course of those 70 years up to 1947 by the local Arabs, who were supported by the Palestinian societies, some of whom turned into proper sovereign states, growingly during those years from the 1880s until 1947. The specific trigger of the war was the passage by the United Nations General Assembly of Resolution 181, the map of which you can see on the behind me, which recommended the establishment, the partition of Palestine into two states, one Jewish, the other Arab. As you can see, the contours of what was supposed to be granted, earmarked for Jewish statehood, and what was supposed to be earmarked for Palestinian statehood. The Palestinian Arabs, and in their wake, the immediate wake, their Arab state patrons rejected the resolution, and the Palestinians started shooting at Jews, traffic, settlements, etc., in Palestine on the following day. The resolution passed on the 29th of November. On the 30th of November began Palestinian militiamen shooting at Jewish targets, and that was the beginning of the 1948 war, which snowballed from sporadic attacks here and there into a full-fledged civil war and then into a full-fledged conventional war. The war of 1948 was unusual in that it combined two separate parts and very distinct parts, one being a civil war between the end of November 47 and the middle of May 1948, a civil war between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine, which was still governed nominally and in some ways realistically by the British Mandate authorities, meaning the British government of Palestine and its armed forces, and who were there until the 14th of May. And that was the civil war, which was decided with a Jewish victory over April and the first half of May. They crushed the Palestinian militias and Palestinian society, which led straight to the conventional war, which was between the newfound state of Israel, which was declared and established on the 14th of May, and the Arab states around it, who invaded the territory of Palestine, most of whom also attacked the state of Israel, which had just been founded on the 15th of May. On the 15th of May, the armies of Jordan, Syria, Egypt and Iraq crossed the border, and as I say, most of them attacked the Jewish state. I'll get to why I'm making this distinction among the Arab participants in a second. And that was the conventional war between Israel and the Arab states, which lasted from the 15th of May 1948 until the end of the first week of January 1949. That's when the hostilities ended, on the 7th of January 1949. There were several more months of a truce, and by July 1949, that war had officially ended with the signing of armistice agreements between Israel and each of its belligerent neighbors, the last one being signed with Syria on the 20th of July 1949. That officially ended that war. Now I want to address a number of issues which are raised in the conclusion of my book, which is called 1948, History of the First Arab-Israeli War. One relates to the nature of the war, of the 1948 war, and that's something Charles referred to in a sense. Until now, the conventional wisdom has been that the war was a political, territorial war between two nationalist or national groups striving after territory, that was its nature. It was incidentally, if it was, and it was in part certainly a territorial national war between two national movements, if it was such a war, it was an unusual war in the sense that the Palestinian Arabs desired all of Palestine. Now, normally territorial national wars between states, for example, France and Germany in the 19th, 20th centuries, they fight about borderlands, they fight about marchlands, they fight about Alsace-Lorraine, or maybe far-flung colonial territories which one covets and one possesses or something. But they don't fight about the whole of the territory. France didn't want to capture all of Germany, and Germany didn't want to take over all of France at any point in their conflict. Here you have a conflict in which at least one side covets and desires as its political aim the conquest of the whole of the country, and that's the Palestinian Arab side, which had rejected the partition resolution and said all of Palestine is ours. The Jewish side agreed to the partition resolution, said yes to it, and agreed to the division of Palestine, even though traditionally the Zionist movement had wanted all of Palestine as its fatherland, patrimony, etc., because that was, and they looked back to the biblical, the past, those were the contours, more or less, of the biblical land of Israel. But the Zionist movement from the 1930s until between 1937 and 47 sort of gradually came to agree to a partition of Palestine and agreed to the United Nations map, which we see here. So in that sense, the Civil War was an unusual, if it was a nationalistically motivated war, it was unusual in that one side wanted all of Palestine, not just some sort of clash about borderlands. But what I was going to say essentially is that it wasn't just a political national war. It was that also, but it wasn't just that. It had a cultural, religious dimension, certainly from the Palestinian Arab side and in some measure from the Arab side in general, those taking part in the war. And that element would be simply called jihad. In other words, the war was waged by many Palestinian Arabs and many of the Arab leaders as a jihad, a war against the infidel presence in Palestine, which they totally rejected on religious grounds, not political, or perhaps as well as political nationalist reasons, but also on religious grounds, and that's important. And that's something which has been ignored, that aspect, by most previous historians, partly because Arab rhetoric was always couched and remains couched often in religious terms. So people say, well, that's not important, that's just the way they speak. When Sadat comes to the Knesset in 1977, he opens with, Bism Allah, in the name of Allah, and then he gives his speech. But this is the way, this is rhetoric. But what I'm saying is that there was a serious jihadi momentum and impetus in the war itself, in the waging of the war, in the motivation of the Arabs fighting it, Palestinian Arabs in the first half, Arab leaders and Arab soldiers and whatever. Now there's a problem in this. There's a problem in this, how you define the war, which is that we don't have Arab sources. We have some Arab newspapers which are usually trash and which are worthless. You're not real sources. They're politically connected, political papers. All the Arab states are dictatorships, so none of them, they control the media. So there's no free press. And we're talking about 4-page or 2-page, essentially what would be called rags. It's not the New York Times. And apart from that, the Arab archives, the state archives, are all closed, remain closed to this day, as is normal, routine in dictatorships. They don't open their archives. So we don't know what was said in the cabinet meetings in Baghdad or in Cairo when they were deliberating invading Palestine. We don't know what the Arab Higher Committee, the Palestinian Arab leadership, debated and did they think in terms of jihad? Did they speak that way among themselves? We don't have this material. It may exist, it may not exist, but Arab archives remain closed, so we don't know if anything exists there or what exists there, but we don't have access to it. On the Jewish side, you do have access. You know exactly what was going on. In fact, Jews tended to write much too much. Every sergeant reports back to his commander and up the chain of command and down the chain of command. And you have enormous amounts of material in the military and civil archives in Israel about what was going on. So you basically have a very clear picture. There may be some things you don't know in terms of intelligence and so on, but essentially you've got the picture once the archives are opened, and they were opened in the 1970s and 80s. Still, some things remain classified, and us historians object to it and so on, but essentially you can get a good picture of what was going on. But on the Arab side, you have a problem did King Farouk, did King Abdullah of Transjordan or Jordan, did they see it as a jihad or didn't they? And as I say, you've got this problem, but we have enough impressionistic evidence in the material available to indicate that many of the Arabs, Palestinian and outside Palestine, regarded the war in jihadi terms. That is, they saw it as jihad, perhaps more than jihad, but also jihad. I'll give you a couple of clear pieces of evidence, though the subject still requires more research, much more research, and which would be maybe possible if and ever Arab archives are opened. On the 1st of December 1947, 3 days after the partition resolution, 2 days after the shooting had begun in Palestine, the ulama, the Council of Wise Theologians of Al-Azhar University, which is the leading university in the Sunni Muslim Arab world, which is the majority, of course, of the Muslim world, the Sunnis, and of course the first university in the Arab world. The Council of Theologians, headed by the rector, the Sheikh al-Azhar, issued a fatwa. They issued a religious ruling of jihad. On the 1st of December 1947, the ulama of Al-Azhar call for worldwide Muslim jihad against the Zionist enterprise, which is about to turn into a state in accordance with the United Nations partition resolution. It calls on all Arab males to come and fight, those who can't send some money, etc., etc. But there is this call. In April 1948, after the civil war had begun, it was 4 months into the Civil War, 5 months into the Civil War, the Council of Al-Azhar reissues the fatwa for jihad. Again, and this is in preparation for, and perhaps trying to push the government as well into, the invasion of Palestine by the Arab states, including the Egyptian government. So basically Al-Azhar is telling the Egyptian government, you can't avoid entering this war in Palestine, especially now that the Palestinian Arabs are being crushed by the Israeli forces. So they reissue the fatwa calling for jihad. Interestingly, this fatwa is reissued a third time by the ulama of Al-Azhar in December 1948, by which time the Arabs have lost the war. The Egyptians have essentially been defeated. Their army is about to be surrounded in the Gaza Strip, which will lead them to call for peace, for truce and negotiations, which lead eventually to the armistice agreement. But in December, the war is lost for the Arabs, and yet Al-Azhar reissues the fatwa for jihad, essentially meaning we may have lost this round, but we call on all Muslims to renew the invasion or to renew the assault on the Zionist enterprise, which is now called the State of Israel, in the future. We may have lost the round. We're calling it's your duty by heavenly demand to continue the war later on. In Jerusalem in January 1948, 2 months into the start of the Civil War, in January 1948, a woman called Matiel Muranam is interviewed. And the interview exists in transcript. I don't know where it was published and if it was published, but we have the transcript of the interview in Zionist, Central Zionist Archive files. Now, this woman, Matiel Muranam, was a Christian from Lebanon who'd married a Palestinian Muslim and moved to Jerusalem. And she gives an interview in Jerusalem in January 1948, two months into the Civil War, and says in the interview the following: "The United Nations decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred." Now, why do I bring this as a piece of evidence? It shows that even a Christian woman, and she was the head of what was the so-called Palestinian Arab Women's Association, which was an affiliate of the Arab Higher Committee, which was the leading body of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, chaired by Haj Amin al-Husseini. But she leads this branch of this movement, the women's branch. I don't know, maybe it had 5 members, maybe it had 50 members. It wasn't a very powerful organization. Women were not exactly prominent in Arab politics at the time, or in Palestinian politics. Still aren't in effect. But she was an intelligent Christian woman from Lebanon, and she speaks in terms of jihad, and she's aware that jihad has been declared and that the Arabs are united in this view of the war as jihad. That's what I'm essentially speaking of. I can bring you other pieces of evidence when King Abdullah, the most moderate of the Arab leaders, who's in fact been in some form of collusion or secret talks with the Jews even before the 48 war, and after the war will even start discussing secretly peace with the Jewish state, the first of the Arab leaders to do it, and gets assassinated partly for that reason by Palestinian gunmen in 1951. King Abdullah, on the eve of the start of the second part of the war, that conventional war in which his army crosses the Jordan River from East Jordan into Palestine and then ends up fighting the Jews around Jerusalem, he tells his troops in his address to the troops as they are about to cross the river, he says to them, some of you may die and then you will become shaheeds, you'll become martyrs, a religious term of course, and those of you of course who survive will be able to tell your grandchildren, we were great heroes in this war. But the tone of it was a religious pronouncement. Again, there's the problem of they speak in a certain type of rhetoric. It may not mean that he thought this was jihad, but maybe he thought his soldiers thought this was jihad and he wants to inculcate or stress that for them. But it's interesting. On the Jewish side, the war is not jihad. It's not a holy war. Why is it not a holy war? Because 90% of the Jewish population of Palestine, which at the time incidentally numbers 630,000 altogether, 630,000 Jews live in Palestine at the start of the war. By the end of the war, there will be maybe 700,000 because there's been some immigration to Palestine. Of these 630,000, about 90% are secular Jews. They belong to a movement which in fact had rebelled against God and the world of their fathers, which was a religious world. They renounced and denounced God. His name doesn't even appear, incidentally, in Israel's Declaration of Independence from the 14th of May, as the word God, of course, does appear in declarations of American independence or whatever. God wasn't in their minds, and they weren't religious. So when they're thinking about the war, they're thinking about the 90% of Jews who actually conduct the war. There is a small religious Zionist faction in the country among those 630,000, but they're far away from the levers of power. They're unimportant, unlike today when religious parties are very important in Israel's politics. Not dominant, but important. Then they were unimportant. They bring them into the coalition because they want religious representation as well, that they should be represented in a democratic government, but they're unimportant. They don't control the army, they don't control the secret services, they don't control anything, the foreign ministry. They're unimportant. And the 90% who are leading and constitute the Jewish population going to war are religious. They don't think in terms of holy war. This is a war about territory. We want to establish a Jewish state, etc. A second subject which arises is the war aims of the two sides, and they're worth going into. And we're talking about more than two sides, because you have, on the Arabs, in the Jewish side, you've got a Jewish Zionist enterprise which turns into a state, and on the Arab side you've got a number of different Arab governments, as well as before that the Palestinian Arab leadership. So there's more than a number of sides participating, more than two sides. On the Jewish side, the war aims are fairly clear. The first major war aim, both of the Zionist enterprise before the Declaration of Independence in May 48 and after the Declaration of Independence, the State of Israel, the main war aim is clear. It's to weather the Palestinian Arab assault in the civil war and to weather the pan-Arab assault by the Arab armies, which had begun on the 15th of May 1948. To survive and to establish the state and to survive as a community in Palestine. That's the major war aim. Nobody doubts that in terms of the historiography. No historian says this wasn't the war aim. This was the main Zionist war aim. But there are two other war aims which accrue in the course of the fighting to the Zionist side. That is, the Zionists have two further war aims, in my view. One of which I think is accepted by most historians, and the second one is disputed by historians. The second war aim, after the survival, is to expand the territory of the Jewish state beyond those partition borders. These partition borders make no sense. The Arabs have just attacked us. It shows how vulnerable we are, and the Arab states are about to invade us. We want better, more secure borders. We want to expand the state. It didn't mean that they wanted all of Palestine. That is, as a war aim, to expand the territory beyond the 6,000 square miles which the UN had allocated for Jewish statehood, but not the full 10,000 square miles which constituted a mandate Palestine. So the war ends up with 8,000 square miles of the 10,000 which constitute mandatory Palestine in the hands of the Jews, and that's the state of Israel after 1949, 8,000 square miles. The army could have captured the remaining 2,000 square miles reached the Jordan River, taken the West Bank, taken the Gaza Strip, was much more powerful at the end of the war than Jordan and Egypt and any other Arab state interested in further engaging the Jewish army. But they didn't do that, and Ben Gurion had his reasons, and they never conquered the whole of the territory. But the aim was from probably March, April, when the war against the Palestinians, the civil war, wasn't going so well, the aim was to expand the Jewish state beyond these borders. And I think, as I say, historians don't really discount or question, most historians don't question this as a real war aim of the Zionist side from April, 5 months into the war, from April 1948. The third aim, and this one is controversial among historians. Not all of them agree with what I'm going to tell you, but I think that's true. I think a third war aim was to reduce the number of Arabs in the emergent Jewish state by expulsion, by just watching them go and not letting them back, to reduce the number of Arabs. These Arabs, after all, had just tried to kill Israel and to maybe kill the 630,000 Jews in this territory. We have every right now to reduce their number. They will be a potential fifth column if they stay in the state. They will not be loyal citizens. Better that as few of them remain, in my view, perfectly logical in terms of what was happening. They attacked, they started the war, they tried to destroy us. As few of them remain, the better. So that was the third war aim. As I say, there are historians who dispute this, that this was a war aim, and it was never turned into official policy. The government never decided about that. Let's reduce the number of Arabs, let's throw the Arabs out. There was no cabinet decision about that. You don't find any decision of that sort in the meetings of the general staff of the IDF, but it was a war aim in some unofficial way, and also helped to reach that result of a Palestinian refugee exodus. There's a connection between the two, even though it's not official policy. Those are the Jewish war aims, and they're fairly clear, as I say, because we have the documentation, essentially. The Arab war aims are not as clear. The Arab war aims are not as clear because we don't have the documentation. We don't know what they really aimed. We know that the Egyptian Foreign Ministry on the 15th of May, on the day of the invasion, 1948, issues a statement why the Egyptian army is invading Palestine in order to save their Palestinian brothers who are being terrorized and fleeing as a result of Jewish attack. That they write as their official, but they can't, of course, say we're violating the United Nations partition resolution and invading Palestine because we want to destroy the Jews and throw them into the sea, because this is 3 years after the Holocaust, and that would not really be acceptable by the international community. So they don't say that. They say we're coming to save our Palestinian brothers. And I'm sure there's something in that. The Arab armies do invade because they know the Palestinians are losing the civil war, or just about lost the civil war, and we have to come to their aid. Otherwise, we will be overthrown by our own people who demand that we intervene. They have to intervene because they've generated enough hatred of Israel in the previous year and 2 years that they have to send their armies in, even if they know their armies are not going to win the war. And that's really what happens, certainly in Egypt and Syria and Iraq. They don't really believe they're going to win the war. That's certain. But I would say the general war aim is to harm the new Jewish state. I don't know if it's to throw the Jews into the sea. There's no evidence of that. We don't have Arab archives. We don't know what Farouk told his generals, what the generals told the brigadier commanders. We don't know the brigade commanders. We don't know what their war aims are from their documentation, but we know where their armies went. And we know what certainly was said on the Arab radio stations, newspapers, and so on. The atmosphere was of attacking the Jews, taking land from the Jewish state, maybe destroying the emergent Jewish state. We don't know, but that seems to have been what was the purpose. We know that the Egyptian army, when it crossed the border, did enter Jewish territory and conquer Jewish territory. That is territory assigned by the United Nations for Jewish statehood. The Iraqi army, which crosses the Jordan River initially at Gesher, Jisr Majami as it's called, invades Jewish territory when it crosses the river. And we know the Syrian army invades and takes a chunk of Jewish territory when it crosses the Jordan just south of the Sea of Galilee on the 15th of May. So these three countries do attack the Jewish state's territory. do they want us to take chunks of the Jewish territory or destroy the state in toto? We don't know. My assumption would be, had it been like a knife through butter and the sailing was clear and you can get to Tel Aviv and Haifa, the Jewish centers of population, without any problem, they would have done that, and they would have thrown the Jews maybe into the sea, maybe not thrown. They would have destroyed the Jewish state if it had gone smoothly. That's my impression of what was going on. But since they encountered strong Jewish forces, which basically blocked their advance, we don't know what their ultimate aim was, and we know that they did stop, their invasion was stopped before they thoroughly entered the major concentrations of Jewish population. The fourth country in this coalition which invades Palestine, incidentally the fifth member, Lebanon, never invaded Palestine, even though its radio stations on the 15th of May announced the Lebanese army had crossed the border and was joining its Arab brothers in the attack on the Jewish state. The Lebanese never crossed the border. So they never actually joined the invasion. But that's, it's an interesting point, but it's, and the Jews didn't know that, as you see from Israeli intelligence communications, that the Jews don't know whether the Lebanese armies actually crossed. Because there was a force which did cross from Lebanon into Palestine in the Galilee, which was an Arab Liberation Army force, which is a force of volunteers, but not the Lebanese army itself. It never actually crossed. But this wasn't clear to the Jewish intelligence agencies in the first days of the invasion. The fourth major element in the invasion, the fourth major participant, is Jordan. And Jordan is a sort of a, if you like, the worm in the apple, or poses a large question mark, because Abdallah had been in secret negotiations, the king of Jordan had been in secret negotiations with the Jewish agency, which was leading the Jewish state until the state became a state and has a formal government of Israel. Had been in secret negotiations with the Jews about partitioning Palestine between Jordan and the Israelis or the Zionists. Not between the Palestinians and the Zionists, but between Jordan and Zionists. What King Abdallah of Jordan wanted was a chunk of Palestine for himself, not for the Palestinians, for us, Jordan. He wanted to annex part of Palestine, what he called the Arab part of Palestine, to enhance his own kingdom, especially to give it something with prestige, like East Jerusalem, Hebron, towns which had international resonance, whereas his little desert kingdom across the Jordan was basically nothing. It's a patch of desert in terms of importance, and Abdallah wanted something slightly more to, commensurate with his own self-image and so on as a great Arab king. So he has these secret talks with the Jews. They sort of agree, not in writing, but in conversations. Golda Meir goes famously in November 47, before the UN resolution, she goes to Jordan to meet Abdallah, and they basically agree on partitioning Palestine between themselves, between Jordan and Israel, the emergent state of Israel, sidelining, if you like, the Palestinians, which the United Nations was about to earmark a part of Palestine too. When the armies crossed the Jordan, his armies, the Arab Legion as the Jordanian army is called, it basically spreads out and occupies what we call today the West Bank, that most of this yellow area in the center of the country, the West Bank, Hebron in the south, Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin in the north, he basically occupies much of that West Bank, but doesn't attack the Jewish state's territory, according to this map, at any point. The Jordanian army never crosses the partition borders and attacks the orange areas. It stays in the yellow area. In other words, he doesn't aim to fight the Jews. He basically abides by his agreement with Golda Meir and the Jewish agency from 46-47. The problem is Jerusalem. He goes for Jerusalem and he wants to take over the holy sites in East Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the Mosque of Omar, the Church of Nativity, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and so on. Because that's important to him. And his father, incidentally, is buried on the Temple Mount, Abdallah's father, Hussein ibn Ali. And that causes problems because the Jews think the area is earmarked, as you can see in the map, to United Nations trusteeship rule. It's not supposed to be part of the Jewish state or the Arab state, according to the partition, but he sent his army to East Jerusalem, and the Jews fear that he wants to take West Jerusalem as well, where 100,000 of those 630,000 Jews live. And they can't allow that. They can't abide by that. He's conquering West Jerusalem, and his army reaches in the the yellow area in the middle, more or less to the outskirts of Tel Aviv, it reaches a place called Latrun, which cuts the road from Tel Aviv to West Jerusalem, from the Jewish main concentration along the coast in Tel Aviv to Jewish West Jerusalem with its 100,000 Jews. They cut the road at Latrun, and this forces the Jews to end up fighting him, to open the road to Jerusalem so it's not besieged and doesn't fall to this Arab siege, even if it's not actually assaulted by the Arab Legion. So they end up fighting in this big war between the Jews and the Arabs. That is the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, and the Haganah, which turns eventually the Jewish Self-Defense Force, which eventually turns into the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli army. They end up fighting and battling over the road to Jerusalem and around Jerusalem, but neither side has really intended that, and it's due to misperceptions on both sides of the intentions of both sides. So they end up fighting, but the Jordanians, as I say, and that's the crucial point, when they enter Palestine, do not attack the Jewish state at any point, meaning the Jewish state according to the partition borders. Unlike the other three Arab participants, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. We don't know, as I say, what the ultimate, I'll just conclude this thing about Arab war aims, we don't know what they were. We know what Jordan's war aims are, more or less, how its army marched, what he told his British patrons they're about to do, but we don't know what the other Arab states really intended in the invasion. We do know they intended to harm the Jews, that's obvious. How far and where they intended to go at the end of the day, we don't know. It's open to question. The Jews at the time, and this is crucial, believed they were under threat of a second Holocaust. 3 years after the Germans had killed Europe's Jews, the Arab armies were attacking the new Jewish state with its 630,000 inhabitants, and had every right to fear that the Arab states were bent on throwing them into the sea. This is what the Arab radio stations said, even if Arab leaders did not announce this publicly or formally. A third question which arises from the war, or a third issue, is the issue of refugees. And here maybe I'll surprise you a little bit, but the war created three refugee problems. The 48 war created three refugee problems. The one we know about because it's still with us, and the other two we don't know about because they're not with us. The first refugee problem is the Arab-Palestinian refugee problem. 700,000 Arabs, more or less. There's arguments about the figures, but 700,000 is probably about the right number. 700,000 are uprooted from their homes in the course of the war. A few of them are expelled, some of them leave their homes under Arab advice or orders, and the majority simply flee battle. That is, they flee from places which are attacked or about to be attacked. The shelling by Jewish forces of a village, the villagers flee. Why do Jews attack villages? Because the villages and the towns in the Arab side, just like the villages and the towns on the Jewish side, are the bases of the Arab militias. Like the Jewish towns and villages, the kibbutzim, are the bases of the Jewish militias. So it's a civil war. It's not a normal conventional war in the desert between armies of tanks. It's a guerrilla war between unconventional forces which are sort of intertwined in terms of population. And the war leads to, if you like, I can talk much more about this. I've written 3 books about it. In fact, I can talk endlessly about it if you like. The war leads to a creation of 700,000 what are called Palestinian refugees. I don't like the term, incidentally, refugees, because a refugee, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary, is somebody who is uprooted from his home by a war, by religious persecution, etc., but not from his home, from his country. That's the way the Oxford Dictionary defines a refugee. Somebody who's uprooted from his country by war, persecution, and so on. Of the 700,000 people who became so-called refugees in 1948, 47, 49, about 500,000 ended up in other parts of Palestine, not outside their country. They remained in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are parts of Palestine. Only about a third of them ended up in Jordan, that is Transjordan, Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, and a small number in Iraq. So the word refugee isn't exactly right about them, and certainly is not pertinent to what are called today by the United Nations Palestinian refugees, because the Palestinian refugees today, who number 5 to 6 million, are mostly the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of those original 700,000, of whom very few are alive today. They were old people, yeah, by now. So the 5-6 million children, great-grandchildren, etc., of the 700,000 are deemed refugees by the United Nations, which is an unusual title because this is the only refugee population in the world in which the refugeedom is handed down from father to son. Basically because they're not absorbed, or partly because they're not absorbed by their host countries, as Vietnamese refugees are in America, or wherever Czech refugees are, German Czech refugees are in Germany, and so on, and it doesn't pass down the generations. But anyhow, this is a say. But that was the first refugee problem. As I say, I can talk, if you like, about what happened in '48 to create the refugee problem, if you like, in questions and answers. The second refugee problem created in the '48 war is Israeli refugees. In the course of the war, 70,000 Jews are uprooted from their homes, either from fear of a potential or impending Arab attack on their settlements, or by actual Arab attack or even conquest of Jewish settlements. Now, 70,000 doesn't sound like much, but don't forget we're talking about a population of 630,000. So it's more than 10% of Palestine's Jewish population is uprooted from their homes in the course of the war. The Israelis win the war, so almost all of them go back to their homes. There are some who don't, like the Jewish population of the old city of Jerusalem, the Jewish quarter, are exiled permanently from the old city as a result. But most of them are women and children who've been sent away from border kibbutzim into the interior of the Jewish area, the concentration along the coastal plain, to be out of harm's way. And of course they win the war, the Jews, and the Jews go back to the areas, and even to areas which are also conquered by the Israeli army. So of course after the war there's no Israeli refugee problem. After '48, there's no more Israeli refugee problem. But it was a serious problem at the time. If in America today 10% of the population was forced out of their homes, we're talking about 30 million people being uprooted. You would understand that's a serious problem. So 70,000 at the time was a serious problem for the Jewish side in the course of the war. The third refugee problem created by the war was created from '48 until 1964. In other words, a refugee problem emerged of the Jews who had lived until 1948 in Arab countries. Large Jewish communities, hundreds of thousands in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, tens of thousands in Yemen, 150,000 in Egypt, in Iraq, 50, 60,000 in Egypt, 70,000 or whatever the number is in Syria. All these communities, as a result of this war, became refugees. They were driven out. The word expelled is wrong. They weren't expelled by the Arab states, even though there were some expulsions, for instance, in Egypt in 1956 of Jews. But most of them weren't expelled officially, formally, by armies going to their homes and throwing them out. They were forced out or intimidated into flight, is the right phrase, to what happened to the Arab community, the Jewish communities in the Arab lands. They were intimidated by their neighbors who said, you belong to a people who've just expelled the Arabs from Palestine, or we are fighting you in Palestine, you are their brothers, you are a suspected fifth column in our country, in Iraq, because you sympathize with the Jews in Palestine, Israel, we don't want you here. And they were intimidated into flight by the societies among whom they had lived for thousands of years, in terms of Iraqi Jewry, for example, which dates from, 800, 700 BC, and in other places more recent, but had been living for hundreds, centuries in the Arab lands, and governments which persecuted them. In other words, there was social intimidation of the Jews to leave, and governments which took active steps to force Jews out. Massive fines on the Jewish community by the Iraqi and Egyptian government, for example, the jailing of the leadership, hundreds or several thousand, in fact, Egyptian and Iraqi Jews were put in concentration camps in Iraq and Egypt in the course of the '48 war to intimidate the population, to take money from it, to extort money, but basically as punishment for what had happened to the Arab armies and the Palestinian Arabs in Palestine. And this forced, as I say, flight of the Jews from the Arab lands. And today there's no Jews except for a couple of thousand maybe in Morocco and a few hundred maybe in Tunisia. There are no Jewish communities left in the Arab lands. We're talking about 700,000 to 800,000 Jews who were forced out of the Arab lands as a result of the '48 war. It's not the Palestinians, incidentally, who threw them out. It's the Arab states and Arab societies, but nonetheless they were forced out, leaving vast amounts of property behind, just as the Palestinians left vast amounts of property behind when they were uprooted from their homes in Palestine as a result of the war. That problem no longer exists also because almost all of these 700,000 to 800,000 Arabs were absorbed by Israel, poorly absorbed, well absorbed, leaving all sorts of tensions between the original inhabitants, the Ashkenazi Jews, and the Sephardi Jews who just arrived, but they were absorbed. They got houses, they got schools, they got factories, and they were absorbed, and the problem vanished. And the upper class of the Jews in Arab lands moved either to France from the Maghreb or to England from Iraq and Egypt and so on, and they too vanished as a problem. So there is no Jewish refugee problem from the 48 war, but one was certainly created by the war. And some people even say, well, it's like an exchange of population. 700,000 Arabs left Palestine, or the area of Palestine which became the Jewish state, and 700,000 to 800,000 Jews left the Arab states and went to Israel. In historic, overall terms, you can say there was a sort of an exchange of population. But of course, Palestinian Arabs don't like that term and don't see the equivalence there. There's, of course, a vast difference. The Jews from the Arab lands, 99% of them, don't want to go back to the Arab lands from which they basically fled. The Arabs who fled Palestine or were pushed out of Palestine or were invited to leave by their leaders, as happened in various places, do want to go back to their lands and homes in Palestine. So in that sense, there's no symmetry. One last thing I'll raise, and then we'll open the floor to questions, and that's one last issue, and that's the balance of forces in the 48 war. The question always being, how did David beat Goliath in this war? How did the Jews, numbering 630,000, beat the 1.3 million Arabs who lived in Palestine? They were 2 to 1, 2 to 1 Arabs in Palestine versus Jews. And how did they beat the Arab states, who had, of course, tens of millions of people? How did these 630,000 Jews prevail over the Arab states? And there's a moral issue here which leads to political conclusions, because liberals, the West, which is essentially liberal or was essentially liberal, always favors the underdog. And the underdog, if it's the Jews of Palestine, 630,000 being invaded and attacked by all these millions of Arabs and somehow prevails, they'll be favored by the West, and this will translate into political support. And it did. And this was the Zionist narrative which won in the battle of who was stronger and who was David and who was Goliath and so on. But wars are usually won by the stronger side. And Israel was the stronger side in this strange war. Why was the Jewish community of 630,000 stronger than the Arab community, which was double its number, and the Arab states, which was 10 times, 20, 30 times larger? They won because they were well organized, they were politically conscious, very highly educated in comparison to their Arab neighbors in Palestine and outside. A lot of them had military experience because a lot had served in World War II in Allied armies. The British Army, 28,000 of Palestinian Jews had volunteered to. Tens of thousands had fought in the Russian army and eventually settled in Palestine. So they went to war with a large experienced corps to begin with. And as I say, they were highly motivated because the Jewish side had just had the Holocaust. Their cousins and brothers and fathers had all died in Europe, and they knew or believed that this is what the Arabs intended for them. The Arabs on the other side didn't think the Jews were about to kill them all. This, wasn't imaginable, and this wasn't the motivation on the Arab side, especially when you're talking about invading armies from faraway Iraq or Egypt. Nobody intended to capture Egypt or capture Iraq. They never thought their countries were in danger or their peoples were in danger, so they had much less motivation. You'd think the Palestinian Arabs were highly motivated, and they probably were, but they knew they had an escape hatch. They could just go eastwards into Jordan, into Syria, into Lebanon, and escape if something bad happened. And that's what they did in large measure. The Jews had nowhere to go to. They had the sea. Nobody else wanted them. So in terms of motivation, there's a complete asymmetry there, and the Jews fight better. As I say, they're more highly motivated, more experienced, etc. The Jews had also been organized for war. They organized themselves for war because they said from the beginning, the Arabs want to attack us and kill us. That's what the Jews believed from the 1880s, or certainly from the World War I onwards, that this is what the Arabs intended for the Jews. They intended eventually to throw them into the sea. So every kibbutz was built as a fortification. They had houses and children's homes and so on, but they had trenches around, and they had perimeter fences, and they had bunkers against shelling, and they had a small armory for arms, and they trained for it. So the Jews had trained for war and organized themselves for war before 47, before the war emerged. Later people would say they didn't organize well enough, and they were short in this and short in that, but they had organized basically for war. Whereas the Arabs hadn't. They thought they would prevail anyhow by sheer numbers, and if the Palestinians didn't prevail, the Arab states would come to their aid, so they would prevail through that. So they didn't organize. Each Arab village didn't have trench works, didn't have bunkers, didn't have a real armory, didn't have trained personnel. They had militiamen. What are militiamen? They're Arabs who have guns under their beds, because they've always had guns under their beds, because they were being attacked by Bedouins over the centuries. So people have guns. They have old Turkish rifles, new British Enfields, but it's all very disparate. They don't have company level weaponry like heavy machine guns or mortars, but they have light weapons. Probably there were more Arab, in the first half of the war, there are probably more Arabs with arms than Jews in the first half of the war. But they're not organized. Each village has its own 70-man or 50-man militia, meaning people with guns under their beds. But they're not really a military force, and they're not a national force. The Jews in their organization had organized a national military force called the Haganah, which quickly changes its name in June 1948 and changes into the Israeli army. It just changes its name, nothing else. So this is the crucial element in the victory, this organization and the quality of manpower, motivation of manpower. There's also an economic side to war always. You have to pay for wars. You have to finance wars. You need to buy petrol, you need food, you need armaments and ammunition and so on. The Jewish side had the world Jewish community supporting them. They managed to get from mainly from American Jews, about $130 million in the course of the war, sent to the Jewish community in Palestine, basically financing the war. The Arab states weren't as rich, they were poor states. Some of them had a little money, but they weren't particularly philanthropic, so they didn't send money. They don't get money, not real money, from Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, so they're poor, so they don't have the wherewithal to go to war, or at least to provide ammunition, etc. Now this is a part of the story, it's not the whole story. When the Arab states invade on the 15th of May, the Jewish side doesn't have heavy weaponry. On the 15th of May, they are attacked simultaneously by 4 Arab armies crossing the borders from various directions, and they don't have heavy weaponry. The Arab states do. They have some tanks, they have some military aircraft, attack aircraft, small bombers, they have artillery. The Jews have none of this, because the British, who occupy Palestine until the middle of May, won't allow the Jews, even if they've bought the weaponry, paid for it in Czechoslovakia, they can't bring it over, because the British won't allow it. There's a blockade on the coasts. So they bring in some light weaponry, but not heavy weaponry. So on the day of the invasion, on the 15th of May, it's tanks against Molotov cocktails, or Molotov cocktails against tanks, and light pieces of artillery or mortars against real artillery, and aircraft attacking, etc. But this imbalance in heavy weaponry is changed over the weeks. And Ben-Gurion basically says he understands the Jews are going to win. They say it's a matter of how much blood the Jews will have to shed. If they have a lot of weaponry, it'll be less blood. If they don't have the weaponry, it'll be more blood, but they'll still prevail. That's how he feels, and that's what happens. And the asymmetry in heavy weaponry is gradually changed because weapons begin to arrive in the new state of Israel, no longer a British blockade, and the planes begin to come and the tanks begin to come, and so on. And eventually, by the end of the war, the Israeli side even has more heavy weaponry, certainly in terms of ammunition and spare parts, than the Arab side. The Arab armies hadn't really prepared for war. The Arab armies had been trained by the French and the British to guard the Egyptian and Iraqi borders, to fight Kurdish rebels perhaps, but not really to fight. To guard the palaces, but not really to fight. The only army which had trained for war and prepared for war was the Jordanian army, which was the best of the Arab armies, probably the best army in the Middle East at the time, but it only numbered something between 6,000 and 14,000 troops, the number rising as the war progressed. So it was a very small army. The Haganah had 30,000 members on the 14th of May. The Jordanian army, as I say, probably had 8,000, and the other Arab armies may have had larger numbers, but not really with weaponry. In other words, they had some combat formations. What we know, Arab historians tell us that 13,000 Arab troops in all invaded Palestine on the 15th of May. I would say the number probably was closer to 20,000, and they are combat troops, but they're fighting against 30,000 Haganah troops. So they're, even in numbers, the Arabs are numerically inferior, even though their armies are much larger, but they don't send them into battle because they have to worry about who's going to take the palace and who's going to fight on the borders in Kurdistan and so on. So they don't actually send their full armies into the battle. Maybe they think they'll win, maybe they think they're not going to win, but we don't want to send the troops because we're worried about what will happen in the palace, and so on. By the end of the war, the Israeli army numbers 100,000 or 109,000 troops. By January 49, 109,000 out of the 700,000 Jews who live in Palestine at the start of 49 are under arms. So in other words, the Israelis mobilize fully for the war. The Arab states never do that. And at the end of the war, maybe there's 40, 50,000 Arab soldiers in all fighting on the Palestinian front or stationed in the Palestinian front. So the Jews, in terms of numbers, prevail throughout essentially. Even though in the beginning there's probably more, as I say, Palestinians under arms than Jews, but it doesn't come in, it doesn't affect the war, what happens in the war. Partly because the Palestinians, and just to add this one sentence and we'll finish with that, when the battles are local in the civil war, there's a battle for Haifa, there's a battle between Jaffa and Tel Aviv, there's battles in Jerusalem. So the militias in each place fight their own battles, but Nablus doesn't come to the aid of Jaffa, and Nablus isn't attacked. Nobody attacks the Arabs in Nablus. The Jews are fighting, basically the war is fought in Jewish territory, in the area, apart from Jerusalem, in the area earmarked for Jewish statehood. That's where there are Arabs attacking the Jews. So that's where they fight. And in those areas, the Jews are even demographically predominant. And the Arabs in the center of the country don't come to their brothers' aid because they don't have national organization. They probably don't have national consciousness in that sense. They think in geographic terms, we're Haifites, we're Japhites, we're Nabulsis, and we will take care of our town, but no, we're not going to go fight for the Japhites in Jaffa. So when it comes to battles, the Jews end up concentrating more troops in each area than the Arabs usually do. Jewish memory, I'll add this last point, Jewish memory of 48, the people who fought in 48 will often tell you a completely different story. And I've encountered this 1,000 times. We were in this kibbutz and we were attacked by 500 Egyptian troops and we had 60 guns all together and whatever, and we somehow fended them off. And it's true. These stories are true. But on large, it's not true. On large, the Jews were able to concentrate better their troops and prevail, sometimes even on smaller numbers. And as I say, they were better organized, better armed in some stages, and that was showed at the end of the war itself. Okay, I'll leave it with that. So those are 4 points I wanted to talk about in relation to the war in general. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Benny. Thanks. So we'll open up questions. So I'll take the prerogative of asking the first quick question. Can you contextualize what you just reviewed in great detail? It was an impressive...
That's not great detail.
Well, for some of us, in the age of 46 characters or less, it's great detail.
Okay.
Can you contextualize, when you speak about the possibility of this being a jihad or this phenomenon, can you contextualize the relationship, say, to the Mufti of Jerusalem and sort of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood around this time? So what's going on ideologically around this conflict?
Okay, I'll contextualize it even in larger terms, wider terms. Between the West, the Christian West, and the Muslim world, there's been staggered warfare since the first jihad, which was, of course, the Arab emergence from Arabia and the conquest of the Middle East, North Africa, France, and Spain, and so on, in the 7th and 8th centuries. That's the first jihad. There was a second wave of jihad from the Arab side against the West in response to the Crusades, the movement, if you like, a jihad by the West to reconquer the Holy Land at the end of the 11th century, 12th century. There was a jihad on the Arab side to uproot the Crusader kingdoms in Palestine and in another number of other places. And then there was a third wave of Islamic jihad against the West in the 16th, 17th, early 18th centuries with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire towards Vienna, Budapest, and so on, which they didn't conquer, but they tried to expand northwards from the Balkans. Those are the three classic eras of jihad. I believe we are in the midst of a fourth era. If you're looking in the global, large picture of East versus West, Muslim East versus Christian West, we're in the fourth era of jihad. Many jihadis will tell you it's a defensive jihad. The West is making incursions, military, political, cultural, into our areas, and we have to rebuff them. That's how bin Laden might describe what he did in New York, Washington, and so on. But this second era, this fourth round of jihad begins much earlier than this, and it probably begins in the middle of the 19th century when there's a revival of Islamism or Islamic thinking in the Arab world, in the Muslim world in general, and I would say the Armenian and Greek ethnic cleansings by the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, also part of this jihad of Muslims trying to uproot and push back Christians. And unfortunately, Palestine became, at the end of the 19th century, certainly in the 20th century, another battlefield of this jihad against the West. And here it brings in the Jews as part of the Christian, the Judean Christian world, and another front in this jihad. So in that sense, the war in Palestine is part of the context. More focused, to zoom in a bit, you're right, there's a sort of a rising sense of Islam and Islamism, as it's called today, from the emergence of the Brotherhood in Egypt in the late 1920s. And it goes to Palestine. Haj Amin al-Husseini, in fact, thought of himself, the Palestinian Arab national leader, thought of himself as a Muslim brother, was in some way connected to the movement. And it's also crucial to think in terms of national movements around the world at this time in the 20th century. There are no national movements which are led by clerics. National movements are generally led by socialists, liberals, but not by religious figures. The Palestinian Arab national movement is unique, almost unique, I'll give you the exception in a second, of a nationalist movement which is led by a religious figure, a mufti. The other one is, of course, in Cyprus you have Makarios, who's the Archbishop of Cyprus, and he leads the Greek Cypriot nationalist movement, which wants to unite with Greece. But otherwise, national movements are not led by clerics. They're led by anti-clerics usually, and a Palestinian national movement. And this is important because it's in a sense representative. It shows you the importance of religion and eventually jihadism in the conflict from the Palestinian side, that they are led by a mufti. What's also interesting, if I may add to that, is that the Mufti never actually issues a call for jihad in 48. That is, Haj Amin al-Husseini, as far as I know, never publicly issues a fatwa on this subject. I don't know why, I can't explain it, because as I say, the ulama of Al-Azhar do issue such a fatwa, but he doesn't do it, or at least it's maybe kept in secret, but it's not something which is published. But otherwise, the idea of Islamism and jihad in this war and in this conflict is there. There are waves during the war, during the conflict. There are a number of crucial milestones in which you can see the element of religion as being very important in Palestinian consciousness in waging the struggle against the Zionist enterprise. In 1929, the large riots you have against the Jews, in which many Jews in Hebron are massacred and so on, they start during a campaign by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti, over the Temple Mount and supposed Jewish incursion or desire to destroy the mosques on the Temple Mount. That's what triggers the 1929 riots. In 36-39 also there are various calls for jihad during the Arab rebellion against the British. Some of them designated a jihad as well. So and nowadays, of course, the Hamas is very important. So there are periods in the conflict between the Palestinians and Jews, or the State of Israel, in which there's an ascent of the Islamic spirit, and there are the periods in which you hear less about the religious element and it's more political. Yeah.
So David?
Okay. Just to add to what you're saying, Haj Amin al-Husseini is not just any old cleric. He has a certain history vis-a-vis the Jews, and he has a history of exterminationist discourse vis-a-vis the Jews, right?
Sort of.
He does.
No, sort of.
And
You have to be a bit careful with that, because recently Netanyahu said he was the sort of the inspirer of Hitler, which is nonsense. Hitler had his own reasons for anti-Semitism. He didn't need Haj Amin al-Husseini to explain why he should be an anti-Semite. But Haj Amin al-Husseini was an anti-Semite, a general anti-Semite, and he spent the war years helping the Nazis in Europe, raising SS troops, broadcasting to the Middle East jihadi calls, and this is true.
And he would, in those broadcasts, he would make statements.
Sometimes you say, kill the Jews.
Killing
Yeah,
Jews
kill the
is
Jews.
a holy act pleasing to
Yeah,
God.
yeah.
So that takes the operation to another category, it seems to me. Anyway,
No, you're right. The man himself was certainly an anti-Semite and was used by the Nazis and did advocate killing Jews in the broadcast from Berlin. Sure.
Okay. Thanks for your lecture. I have two questions. The first one is obviously.
Is what?
For Arab side, the UN partition resolution obviously was unfair for them. They thought. So my question is, if the partition resolution satisfied the requirements of Palestine and Arab side, do you think the 1948 war still can be erupt? This is first one, and the second is.
Let me answer one at a time. Okay, so.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
It's about the UN partition resolution was unfair to the Arab side because it allocated more land to the Jews than to the Arabs. The problem with that is that some Arabs did say that. The UN partition resolution, if you had that map in front of you, you'd see allocated to the Jews something like 55% of Palestine and to the Arabs 45% of Palestine, though the Arabs outnumbered the Jews 2-1 in Palestine. Well, let me say first. One second. The Arabs said no to the partition resolution. Basically, no part of Palestine, not 1%, not 2%, not 50%, should go to the Jews for Jewish sovereignty. They didn't say only because they're giving them more and we should get more because we're more numerous, we reject it. We reject it because in principle we reject the idea of partition. That was their basic statement. It wasn't because of the numbers. Later they would add, yes, the numbers are also unfair because we're more and they're less, and why are they getting more? Let me add to that. In 1937, the UN Partition Resolution of 1947, in principle, was based on a British commission of inquiry in 1937 called the Peel Commission, which had been the first to issue a partition proposal as a solution to the problem of Palestine. And that Peel Commission had allocated 17% of Palestine to the Jews and 80% or close to 80% to the Arabs, 75-something% to the Arabs. But the Arabs had rejected that under Haj Amin al-Husseini also back in 1937. So it wasn't a question of percentages because they'd rejected a much more favorable to them a resolution, and they still rejected it. So it wasn't really a matter of percentages. Now the second thing I would add about that is most of the territory allocated by the UN in the partition plan of 47 was desert. What was given to the Jews was mostly arid land. Most of it was the Negev desert. Only a small proportion was fertile land. That's one thing. The second thing is the UN in 1947 was cognizant of why the Jews were establishing a state, partly because of what had happened in Europe with the Holocaust, and cognizant of the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who were about to come. That was the idea of creating a Jewish state. There would be a haven for these survivors to come to. So they needed land in which to settle these people. So the partition resolution wasn't geared to the 630,000 Jews living in Palestine in 1947, but to the potential vast immigration of Jews who would be coming, which included millions in effect, because it's Russian Jews and whatever survived of Polish Jewry and so on. So it's not exactly, it wasn't giving it the Jews more, even though they were less, because it was giving to the potential Jewish immigration as well. That was what was underlying it. Yeah.
Thank you. So, the second one, okay, quickly, please.
Still second one. The second one is, you just said Arabic leaders thought 1948 war is jihad. This was a general view, just some of Arabic leaders and peoples thought like this.
Well, we don't know. As I told you, we don't have Arab documentation. We have occasionally diplomats talking to Arab leaders and hearing what they say. We know King Farouk meets, I think it's an American or a British, I can't remember, diplomat in the summer of 1948, and King Farouk of Egypt tells this diplomat, the Arab masses have been riled and are now thinking in religious terms of jihad, and I can't do anything else. I must invade Palestine. I must fight in Palestine. So in fact, even if the leaders aren't thinking in jihadi terms, they know the masses are being, driven by religious impulse. And I gave you the example of what Abdallah said, but generally we don't have the documentation to, fix exactly how much jihadism is in it and how much of something else when they do things.
Okay, so Tyrone and then Dan. And Harold, I see.
Yes,
All right, you might have answered it. I might have missed it where you were talking, but you said that on the Arab side, like they already had weapons before the war even started between them and the Jews. So I wanted to know, like, who was there, like outside sources that supported the Jews that provided them air weapons, or is it like what was the difference?
Okay.
Like, outside sources?
The Arab states, which had become states, Syria, Egypt was a state before, but became more independent after World War II. Iraq, which had become independent a few years before, but became more fully independent during the war. Jordan, which became independent in 46, like Syria. All of these states were officially armed by Western states, by France or Britain, depending who had been the colonial ruler. And those colonial rulers had established these armies, the armies of Jordan, the army of Syria, the army of Egypt, the army of Iraq, and were arming them. The Jews weren't a state, so they couldn't buy arms and reach contracts with anybody before 1948. Nobody would arm them. So what they did, the Jews, was they bought clandestinely on black markets. And Europe was awash with arms after World War II because of the war. And there was one exception in terms of states, and that is Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had been taken over by the communists, by Russia, and Russia said yes to the Czechs and allowed them to enter into contracts with the Haganah and the Israeli state to buy weapons, and these started reaching Israel from the end of March, Palestine from the end of March, but basically after the 15th of May. So there was one state which was helping the Jewish side, which is Czechoslovakia, which was an agent essentially of the Soviet Union, whereas the Arab states were receiving arms regularly from regular suppliers, which were the Western states who had ruled there before. America, it's interesting to note, while politically supporting the Jewish state from the second half of 1947 and voted for partition and recognized Israel immediately after its declaration of independence or establishment, America refused to supply arms to the Jewish side, and in effect from December 1947 imposed a total boycott on embargo on arms sales to the whole of the Middle East from December 47. The United Nations Security Council, towards the end of May 1948, also imposed an embargo of arms sales to the Middle East, and this affected the Arab side. because the Czechs didn't abide by the United Nations embargo and continued to supply Israel with weaponry, whereas France and Britain, which were more obedient to United Nations decisions, essentially stopped sending weapons, ammunition, spare parts to the Arab states from the 24th of May onwards. And this gradually reduced the fighting power of the Arab states. While the Zionist side, its fighting power grew because they were getting these supplies from Czechoslovakia.
I got you on the list. So Dan, followed by Luca, then Maya.
Thanks again for your talk. I really appreciate the information. And I think you sort of mostly covered this, but when the resolution was made, was there the expectation that this would be a peaceful transition? Was there a preparation? Like, I just would love you to sort of focus in a little bit on that moment. Was this, were people immediately prepared for conflict, or was there a sense that this would go over well?
The Prime Minister of New Zealand, I can't remember his name at the moment, like all the heads of states in the Western world and elsewhere in the world, were pressured by the Zionist side to support the partition resolution before it passed. And he writes back in one of his telegrams, the Prime Minister, I think it was of New Zealand, he writes back, but if we pass this partition resolution, it's going to lead to war, because the Arab states have announced this for months. They've been saying in the second half of 1947, if this partition resolution passes, we are going to go to war against this Jewish state. And nonetheless, New Zealand voted for partition because they said there's no alternative. There's no other resolution, there's nothing else on the table, and nothing else makes more sense than partition. So what I'm saying is the Jewish side and its supporters, certainly Ben Gurion, understood or believed, especially given Arab rhetoric in the previous months, that there would be war, and the Palestinian rhetoric as well, there would be war. But they saw no alternative to, and Ben Gurion understood this was the historic moment. You get it now or you don't get it. So you have to declare statehood, and you do it despite what the Arab threats are and despite what is impending, which was Arab invasion. The Americans said to Ben Gurion, if you declare statehood in early May, you declare statehood, there will be war. So let's postpone it. Ben Gurion basically said, we can't postpone it. We've been waiting 2,000 years. That was the phrase. We're not going to postpone it more. And in any case, it's not going to make any difference. We postpone it, again, the problem will arise in 6 months' time. So we'll do it now and hope for the best.
Luca.
Thank you. I'm curious to know to be more about the position that Russia, UK, US, and France took about the war, both the official point of view and the more unofficial point of view.
Okay, the Russian documentation, Soviet documentation on the decision why suddenly Soviet Union supports partition and Jewish statehood and then agrees to arm the Jewish state in the course of the war until in fact 1950 they continued to arm Israel is unclear because the Soviet documentation is not open on this fact. The documentation of the Presidium of the Communist Party, Stalin's office, these things are not open. None of that has ever been open. KGB, which is very important, is not open. The only documentation which is available, or was available for a while at least, was the Foreign Ministry of the Soviet Union, but that wasn't the decision-making body in the Soviet Union. Most historians agree that the Soviets changed tack. The Soviets under Stalin were traditionally anti-Zionist and opposed the establishment of a Jewish state on grounds of problems of minorities in Russia. If Zionism was supported, Jews would start struggling to get to Palestine because they disagreed with the idea of nationalism in general. They wanted, international community. So, and Stalin was an anti-Semite. It's also important, well documented. It's not just somebody throws out the word anti-Semite. So he opposed Jewish statehood. But in 1947, they changed tack. Well, most historians believe they changed tack and became pro-Zionist, supporting the establishment of Jewish state side by side with the Palestinian state, thus voting for the resolution, because they calculated, and it turned out correctly, that a war which would ensue from the partition resolution would help Russian penetration of the Middle East and help throw out the British. It would undermine Britain's position because Britain was supposedly supporting Jordan, Iraq, Egypt it was invested in that. But on the other hand, they had been pro-Zionist, traditionally, and a war between their various clients and the Jews who had the Holocaust behind them, so giving them moral power. This would be bad for Britain, and as it turned out, it was one of the precipitants of British withdrawal from the Middle East. By 1956, Britain was out, and Russia was in. Russia did get in on the back of the war. Despite the fact that they supported the Jews in 48, they managed to penetrate the Arab states by switching sides simply, and then the Arab states got Russian arms and Russian advisors and so on. So this apparently was the main calculation. I would add to that a sort of a sub-level, and nobody knows how important it was in Russian decision-making. The Russians had been fellow sufferers at Nazi hands. Both of the Jews and the Russians had suffered from the Nazis, and in that sense, there was some sort of collegiality or comradeship. Now, this didn't come into, you don't see it in the documents, but some of the Russian leaders were Jews or had Jewish wives and so on at the time in 1947-48. And my sense, certainly this is true about Czechoslovakia, which actually sent the arms. So my sense is that in some way in the bureaucracy helped reach that decision for Stalin. Now, Stalin was a dictator. He decided everything alone, but he also had advisors and people tell him things. So probably somebody may have told him, well, if you do this, support the Zionists, it'll help get the British out. While the guy who was saying this was also motivated by his wife, who somehow had sympathy for the Jewish cause. It may have worked like that as well. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so Harold?
Yes, my question, I have two. The first one is, and it's related to my colleague, that would raise her question. Prior to 1948...
Let me add one sentence to that, sorry. The Arab side, in 1939-45, the Arabs in general had supported the Axis powers. Now, it's not that they weren't democracies, we don't know what Arab public opinion really was, but a lot of the intelligentsia in the Arab world and the Arab governments either sat on the fence or openly supported the Germans and Italians in the war, not necessarily because they were Nazis or anti-Semites, but because they wanted the British and French out of the Middle East, and they wanted the defeat of France and Britain. It would have helped the Arab national cause, that was the idea. So this may also have influenced Russians as well. These Arabs supported the guys who killed 20 million Russians in World War II. We don't really want to support them. But this is vague. There isn't any proof of this. This is just my theorizing. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, no, thank you.
Go ahead, yeah.
Prior to 1948, or this United Nations Resolution 181 that you talked about, how would you describe the kind of political organization of that swath of land that got partitioned? In other words, before 48, if you had Jews and you had Muslims living there together, why would you need to come and chop it up? I mean, why can't you just keep it like it was?
Well,
Then,
okay.
So I'm wondering why the need to chop it up. They
Okay.
were already living together.
Okay. They were living in geographic proximity and sometimes neighborhood next to neighborhood in towns like Haifa and Tiberias and Jerusalem. The land had been conquered by the British from the Ottomans in 1917-18, and the British established a mandate in Palestine in which they ruled for the next 30 years until 1948. During this time, there were Arab attacks on the Jews. Not Jewish attacks on the Arabs, essentially Arab attacks on the Jews, waves of violence. The national movement, the Arab national movement, which had arisen in the 1920s in Palestine, didn't want a Zionist or Jewish presence in Palestine, certainly not a sovereign presence. And this is where the British were heading, having issued the Balfour Declaration, which in a sense supported the idea of Jewish statehood ultimately. So you've got these waves of violence. You've got a British government which rules over the territory and tries to get the two sides to talk and reach some sort of agreed decision. But they can't. The two sides don't agree. The Jews want a state. The Arabs say you cannot have a state here. This is Arab land. We want the British out, we want the Jews afterwards out, we're not going to give you any part of it. And they can't live together. They don't live together. They establish essentially separate economies, a separate political system for the Jews. And the British are governing and trying to sort of keep the lid on this thing for decades until by 1946 the British are weak, the war has weakened them, World War II, and they say enough's enough, enough British life, enough British treasure has been spent here, we're leaving the place. And that'll leave the Jews and Arabs to fight it out, and that's what happens.
So the UN decided to a two-state solution would be, they thought it would be a way to create peace?
They thought it was a just. So I don't know who. I don't know what they thought this was the optimal and side which gives each side some justice. Each side doesn't get what it wants in toto, but it gets a state. That's what the UN was thinking. It gives both sides the minimum of what they want. And the Arabs said no, and the Jews said yes. So many of the people who voted for it, as I said about New Zealand, predicted there would be a war at the end, because that's what the Arabs were saying was going to happen. But they didn't see any alternative, because the British had quit. The British were leaving. They said by August we're leaving. Eventually they brought that forward and left by May. But they said we're leaving. This is in your lap. And the United Nations, this was the only solution they could think of.
Okay. Question. So it's pretty clear from the onset that this is an Arab-Israeli war. My question to you, or Arab-Jewish war, is what did the Arab countries officially and unofficially how did they refer to the Palestinians? I'm curious.
As the Arabs of Palestine.
Arabs of Palestine.
Yeah, didn't really call themselves Palestinians at the time. This is something which comes up later. The Jews were also Palestinians. Anybody who lived in Palestine was a Palestinian. So the Arabs were called the Arabs of Palestine, the Jews were called the Jews of Palestine.
Okay, Rafi?
Thank you.
Bring your notes.
Me? Yeah, okay. This question comes from Said Shaib, not from me. Okay. Said, want to ask you which role for the concept in this land, Israel, given by the God to the Jewish people, play in the establishment state of Israel. And the second question from Said also, why did you refuse to use the expression of refugees to the Palestinian case?
No, I didn't refuse. I said there's a definition, as to the second question, there's a definition in the Oxford Dictionary, or most dictionaries, about what constitutes a refugee, and that's somebody who's uprooted from his country. And most of the Palestinians who were uprooted from their homes in the 48 war ended up in another part of Palestine. They moved from Jaffa to Jenin, from Jaffa to Ramallah, but they didn't move out of the country. A third of them were genuine refugees who had been uprooted and left the country in the course of 48, 49. Most of the Zionists, most of the Jews in 1948 did not seek statehood in Palestine because something was written somewhere in the Bible that God had given the land of Israel to the Jews. They were aware of the Bible. They saw the Bible as an historic document, detailing their history and connection to the land, but they didn't think about God having given it to the Jews. That's the reason we're coming here, and we want to establish a state. They wanted to establish a state in Palestine because for 2,000 years they had been persecuted in the lands in which they lived under the Christians and under the Muslims. And the last persecution, of course, was the Holocaust, and they wanted a state now for the Jewish people, just like the Arabs had 22 states as it is today, or 23, whatever the number is. They also wanted a state for the Jews. That's the reason they wanted it, because that might assure safety for the Jews, which had not been possible in the lands in which they were minorities in Europe, North Africa, etc.
I went to that.
So, Rafi?
Benny, thank you very much for a very good lecture. Really enjoyed that. Some clarifications that this pertaining to the Arab armies that invaded the country in 48 in May. Do you know what were the intentions of the leaders who sent these armies? I'm asking this because you mentioned that they didn't send the entire armies. They sent only a small portion, and you tell me what's the percentage of if you know, the percentage of the armies that was sent. Correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, they didn't send any of the elite platoon, so they sent only the...
No, that's not correct.
Okay, so you're correct. With the exception of the Jonel Legion, I know that, the Arab Legion, but I don't think the Egyptians send the best platoons to fight. So when you don't send the best platoons with the best armory and with a small proportion of your army, what is your intent? Why do you do that?
No, the question is a misrepresentation. Ben Gurion in his diary, Ben Gurion kept a diary. Ben Gurion, the leader of the Zionist movement in Palestine, later the first prime minister of Israel from May 48, but essentially the leader from 1935, kept a diary, and it's one of the major documents available to historians, charting the development of the conflict and so on. In his diary, which is available incidentally on the internet, though it's in Hebrew, he summarized at the end of 1947 that the Arab armies mustered, all told, 165,000 soldiers. And basically was saying they have 165,000 and we have 30,000 members in the Haganah, and this is a real problem, this disparity. But when he said 165,000, he was counting home guard and rear echelon units and all sorts of disparate, maybe gendarmerie, you know, all sorts of units which weren't really army or corps army. When the Arab armies invaded Palestine in May, on the 15th of May 1948, and I say the number of invaders was probably 20,000, they sent in their best units. Not bad units, they sent in their best units, except for the Palace Guard, which may have been a regiment, you know, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, but they sent in their best units. But the problem was that most of the Arab armies, and this is Egypt, Syria, Iraq, many of their soldiers were non-combatants or didn't have arms. What they sent in were those who were properly equipped and properly organized for combat. And that's really what they had, as I say, with the exception of some palace guards and the Iraqis perhaps leaving one or two battalions or maybe a brigade or two to face the Kurds, because the Kurds were in constant rebellion or staggered rebellion against the regime in Baghdad. So what they did send was their best troops and their best weaponry. They didn't leave the tanks behind or the combat aircraft somewhere else. They sent in what they had. That's the truth. But they didn't have weaponry for most of their army. They didn't have proper combat soldiers in large numbers. And they sent in what they essentially had, the Jordanians sending in all of their army, essentially. They may have left a few companies behind, but they sent in their battalions, which were organized by 1948 into brigades. And they sent in everything they had, and they had the best army in the field. And that's what I can tell you about what was sent in. The intentions I talked about at length before. We don't know what their intentions were because we don't have their documentation. What we have is we know about the intentions of the Jordanians, which essentially was to occupy Arab allotted land without fighting the Jews, and they ended up not being able to do that. And we know the way that our Arab armies marched. In other words, we know what they sent in, where they sent it in, and from that you can deduce certain intentions, but not fully. When the Syrians crossed the border at Samach, just south of the Sea of Galilee, and moved towards Degania and attack the kibbutzim there, Degania Aleph, Degania Bet, we don't know where they want to go. We don't know if they want to head towards Afula or whether they want to head northwards towards Tiberias. That's my guess. They wanted to take the Sea of Galilee. But we don't really know. And if they'd gone to Afula and met no resistance, maybe they would have gone on to Haifa and the sea. But maybe they didn't intend to do that. We don't know. And as I say, things also were mobile. They were fluid. It depended on what they encountered and how the other Arab armies performed. The Syrians, which is interesting about the Syrians, they deployed their troops on the 12th, 13th of May in southern Lebanon. Not on the border with Israel to the east along the Jordan River, but on the Lebanese border. And then suddenly the Lebanese told them, we're not marching, we're not joining you in the attack. So they ended up on the 13th of May, the day before, 2 days before the invasion, they shifted their, it was a brigade essentially, initially at least, one Syrian brigade which was destined to attack Israel. They shifted it from southern Lebanon, went eastward and then southwards and reached the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and then crossed over there. In other words, because of political reasons, their line of march was completely changed. So there's politics in it. It's a fluid situation, militarily and politically.
Do we know why Lebanon did not enter?
Yeah, in Lebanon was composed of Christians and, to put it very simply, Christians and Muslims with a sort of a balance between them. But the Christians controlled, that is, they had the position of chief of staff, the commander of the army, and the position of president, who was the most important figure there. That was left over from France and a pact, what's called the Lebanese Pact. The way the government was run, the prime minister was always a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of parliament was always a Shiite Muslim, and so on. That was divided and still is. That's how it still exists, this pact dividing the power in Lebanon. But in 48, the most powerful players were the Christians, mainly Maronites, among the Christians. And the president and the chief of staff of the army were against going to war. They were Christians, they didn't want to fight the Jews. They basically knew, though they couldn't say that, the real enemies would be the Muslims in Lebanon, not the Jews to the south. And they wanted to keep their powder dry for an eventuality of this sort, which of course occurred. There's eventually a Lebanese civil war between Muslims and Christians in the 1970s, partly precipitated by the Palestinian refugees who reached Lebanon as a result of the 48 war. But in any case, these two said, we're not crossing. The president and the chief of staff said, we're not marching. And then they had this idea, instead of that, they sent in a battalion of troops of what was called the Arab Liberation Army, which was an irregular force set up by the Arab League as a result of Arab League decisions at the end of 1947, all composed of Iraqi and Syrian and Palestinian volunteers trained in Syria and then slowly injected into Palestine to help the Palestinians over the following months, December, January, February, March. And as I say, in May, one battalion of these ALA cross over from Lebanon, instead of the Lebanese army, essentially.
So I have Anna, then Ira, then Aaron, and then Irving.
First of all, Professor, thank you very much for your lecture. Secondly, I wanted to make a tiny adding according to the reason why Russia supported Israel. Maybe it's the third reason, or maybe it's even the second reason, because after the Second World War, they had a big quantity of weapons, and they had to sell it somewhere. So they supported Israel because, it's not my opinion, it's the opinion of some professors that I heard, that they needed to support the conflict because just they needed to sell the weapon. And my question, it's more about ideology. I'm not sure if to ask you or Professor Bassam, but maybe I would like to hear your both thoughts. Okay, you were talking about the motivation of Arab people, that it was not enough like to win the war. Actually, I lived in the West Bank for some time, and I lived in Jerusalem, and according to my own experience, and according to the events that had place after the opening of American embassy, I should say that nowadays they really have those motivation. And the thing is that people
really had what motivation? I didn't understand.
The motivation to die for the Palestine. I mean that also according to the thought that the people with low educational level, when they take their religious thoughts, they do not have the rational mind, they take it into their heart, so their thoughts are much more dangerous than people who are really motivated. In one book written by the son of Hamas, maybe you met the book, there was written that Hamas took the primacy into representation of Israel because the Hamas leaders managed to connect those religious thoughts, yes, and the struggle for Palestine, so they politicized religion. Frankly speaking, I didn't know about the fatwas that you were talking about. So were there any changes from the war from 84 years until the Hamas appeared? And what were the changes in the ideology? Why now Palestinians are much more motivated by Hamas than they were motivated at times?
Well, it's a complicated question. Look, the Hamas, for many Palestinians, represent the people willing to fight. Though there are people to the right of the Hamas, the Muslim, the Islamic Jihad, and so on, who say that the Hamas is not really motivated either sufficiently and isn't fighting Israel sufficiently. But most Palestinians regard the Hamas as representing resistance. That is, these are the people who are continuing the battle for Palestine, whereas the Palestinian Authority, led by Abbas and the Fatah, they're not really there in collusion. They're collaborating with the Israelis. They're no longer, they've given up on resistance. So in other words, what the impulse there to support Hamas is, if you like, political in a sense. They just want to continue the battle for Palestine, to regain Palestine and to destroy Israel. But on the other hand, there is a religious motivation, and people have become more religious. When I grew up in Israel in the 50s, 60s, Arab women did not walk around with veils. They walked around without veils. And today, there's no Arab woman, basically, unless they're Christian, who walks around without a veil. So the nature of the place of religion has changed completely in Palestine. They've become Islamized. Islam was less important to them, and now it's...
What you're saying applies even to Indonesia. Throughout
There were no veils there as well. Yeah, sure. So the Muslim world has changed in that sense, and Palestine along with it. Some people somehow regard Palestine as separate, different from the rest of the Muslim world. It's not. It's a Muslim country, and religion has become much more important to them, and also as a motivating factor in the politics of the place, which includes in Palestine, unfortunately, fighting or maybe destroying Israel. That's what I would say. Palestine has been swept up in this Islamic surge, which is global. That's part of the story.
So it became more religious.
Yes. To put it simply, yes.
Professor Morris, thank you very much for this really enlightening talk. When I was growing up, in the late 50s and 60s, 70s, in the narrative in the Jewish community, I'm guessing in Israel as well, largely was that in 48, the Arab populations, the Palestinian populations, left on their own. It wasn't that the Israelis did not throw anybody out. They were, quoting Ben Gurion and others that to stay, please stay, etc. And when I first heard of Benny Morris, it was this guy who said, "Well, that's not really true. That there were instances of expulsion." You talked a little bit about it. Can you be a little more specific on what percentages you think were actually expelled, what percentages totally left on their own, what percentages kind of left as fighting got close to their hometowns?
Yeah, I don't like to go into percentages. What I would say is the vast majority of Palestinian Arabs who left their homes in 48 left their homes as a result of fighting in their villages or around their villages and towns, or out of fear that their towns and villages would be engulfed by the war. That was the main motivation for flight, fear of being engulfed in war. And
partly because of Jewish atrocities.
well, let me get to that. A small number were actually expelled, by which I mean that Jewish forces entered a village, entered a town, and the population was still in place, or in large measure was still in place, and were ordered to leave and left. That's expulsion. And that occurred most famously in Lydda and Ramle on the 12th, 13th, 14th of July, 1948, where there was a vast expulsion of about 50,000 people in the two towns. In most places, there weren't expulsions. In most places, people just fled battle. They fled from encroaching battle. In some places, again a small number, a small proportion, were ordered or advised by their own leaders, and I'm talking here about local leaders, military and political, to leave. In other words, dozens of villages in the coastal plain told their women and children to get out of harm's way, and were shipped out in buses or whatever from these villages from December 1947 onwards. In other words, during that winter and the following autumn and even into the summer, people left. Women and children and old people were essentially advised or ordered to leave by their elders, who wanted the place clear of people who could be targets or could fall victim, to war, which was encroaching. Maybe they thought it would enhance the fighting potential of the youngsters, the young men in the village, who, not having to worry about their women and children, would fight better. That was the theory. What I think it did was essentially undermine the staying power of the adult males, because what happens is the women and children leave, they have less reason to stick around, because they don't have to defend anybody. So they leave more easily. So I think it had a contrary effect, an opposite effect. But that happened in the minority. We have a lot of documentation of these women and children being taken out. There were places where entire communities were advised or told by their leaders to leave, and this happened in Haifa. Later, Israel said it wasn't the local leadership, it was an order from the Mufti or the Arab leaders outside Palestine who had told the Arabs of Haifa, the remaining Arabs in Haifa, to leave. But there is no evidence of that. The local leadership decided, we're not staying here because we're not going to accept Jewish rule. The area had been designated for Jewish rule by the UN partition plan, and the Jews had just won the battle in Haifa on the 22nd of April 48, and the Arab leadership, which had remained, most of the leaders left, but said to the local, the remaining population, we can't accept Jewish rule, we're leaving, and you guys should leave as well, telling the population to leave. So that happened in a few places. There weren't almost any appeals by the Israeli side for Arabs to stay. And this is quite logical. Why should they ask the Arabs to stay who'd just been trying to kill them? So why should they ask them to stay? So there were one or two exceptions, and Haifa is the exception. There, the Jewish mayor of the town, a man called Shabtai Levi, on the 22nd of April, in the joint meeting with the British commander in the area, was about to depart also. The Arab leaders say, we're going to leave, and he says to them, don't leave, you're going into refugeedom, you don't know what's going to happen to you if you all leave, you shouldn't leave. He sort of appealed to them, and there had been a background to that, because there had been a joint municipality, Arab, Jewish, and Haifa, for many years, and an Arab mayor before that who had been very friendly to the Jews, later accused by Arabs of being a collaborator, but he'd worked with the Jewish population. It was at about 50-50 the population, 70,000 Jews, 70,000 Arabs in the town. So there had been a background to the Shabtai Levi asking the Arabs to stay, but that's unusual. In very few places was there a request by anybody to stay, certainly not by Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion wanted them out, or as many as possible, to leave, and encouraged his colonels and the officials to get them to leave, but without turning it into policy, because he also met resistance, and there were colonels who said, no, I'm not ordering people out. This happened, incidentally, in Nazareth, occupied by Israeli troops on the 15th, I think it was, of July, and the local commander of the Israeli occupying force issued an order to his troops to kick out the Arabs of Nazareth, and one of his subordinates, the commander of the 7th Brigade, says to him, no, I'm not carrying out this order. And this forced the issue to reach Ben Gurion's desk, the defense minister. He was prime minister and defense minister, and Ben Gurion, of course, confronted with it in a sort of a semi-public way. It's not public, but a lot of people knew about it in the chain of command, said, no, don't kick them out. And that's why Nazareth still has a large Arab population, because of this argument between the Jewish colonels. And Ben Gurion saying, no, we're not going to kick them out. He had an eye to Western public opinion, what the churches would say, so he left them in place. But just in short, the answer is most people fled because of battle and fear of battle. They had an expectation of returning. This is important to understand. Probably their leaders told them, you will be coming back, because either the Arab armies will invade and will win, or the United Nations will step in and bring you back or allow you to go back. So nobody expected to stay 70 years abroad as a refugee. Yeah.
There is an additional aspect of the displacement that is usually overseen. As the numbers of people displaced on the Jewish and Palestinian sides are similar, about 700,000, as you said, the value of property left behind is unequal. Meaning what? That the Jewish property left behind in Arab countries is about 50% more than the Palestinian property left behind in Palestine. So just for an example, in 2008 terms, about 5 to 6 billion worth of Jewish property was left behind, and about 3 to 4 billion dollars of Palestinian property was left behind. Now, it's important to note that none of the Jewish or Palestinian properties left behind was restituted so far.
Okay, I don't know the figures actually, but I think the figures are a bit problematic. Say land and buildings somebody owned in Aleppo. How much are they worth now? Zero. But they were worth money 20 years ago. Again, property in Israel has tripled 100 times, gone up 100 times in Tel Aviv, in the Tel Aviv area or Haifa area. In 1949, it had a different value. So there's no way of really working it out. It's true that Baghdadi Jewry was very rich. Jews in Cairo and Aleppo and maybe in Damascus were wealthy and lost a lot of property. But I don't know how to compare the things. I wouldn't go into it even, because I think it's too complicated to really work out a real answer.
And should there be any restitution for any?
Look, Israel and the international community, led by people like Bill Clinton over the years, have proposed, instead of a right of return, which Israel says no to and the Palestinians insist on, have always said the Palestinian refugees should receive restitution, compensation for the lands lost. Nobody adds, incidentally, to that the Jews should be restituted for the land and property they owned, but that's a different subject. But in looking for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, negotiators like Clinton have always always said there should be restitution, and the Israeli government has always agreed to that there should be restitution, and Israel would participate in that. Israel would like nothing better than to reach a peace deal and have no refugee return, of course.
Irving.
Yeah, Professor Morrison, your argument that there was a jihadi impetus to the war, as far as I'm concerned, has very, very far-reaching implications for understanding the future of peace.
So maybe I should withdraw it.
It has far-reaching implications for understanding the future of peace. Let me follow this line of thinking. If the war was a war against the infidels of a Zionist enterprise, an island of Jews in a sea of Arab Muslims that could never be accepted, living in juxtaposition with each other, how in the world can a two-state solution ever be viable? And even if it was imposed, how could it ever exist outside of a perpetual state of war?
Well, I think you've answered the question. There's a problem
Can you
there.
explain how I answered that? I don't understand.
No, you're right. You're right.
Saying that they would not accept.
Well, people know. People.
Talking about they're not accepting the right of the state.
Okay, look, I can't talk about the future. You're right. If everybody's motivated by religious motives, or if the Arab side is motivated primarily by religious motives, I think concessions and compromise becomes more difficult, or perhaps impossible. That's what you're basically saying.
I'm saying that this was never about real estate.
It was partly about real estate. That's how I would put it. But also partly, and perhaps in growing measure, it's also about religious ideology, and that's the way I would phrase it.
And in this religious ideology?
Real estate's important in religion also. Just ask the priests in the Temple Mount of the various denominations. Ask in the Church of Nativity or Sepulchre if religion is important and real estate is important in religion. They'll tell you yes, it is also. So real estate figures into the religious context as well.
Thank you, Benny. In the international discourse around this issue, there is almost this sacrosanct dogma that any Israeli presence beyond the 1948 armistice line is a violation of international law. However, when you actually go back and review the armistice agreement, it expressly states that the armistice should not constitute or prejudice any determination of borders. So why is there not any pushback on this assertion?
No, it's true. The armistice agreements, there's 4 of them between Israel and its neighbors from 1949, do say that this doesn't constitute final borders and leaves open the question of borders to future peace negotiations. And that's the truth. That's what still has to be determined. Though Israel and Egypt in their peace agreement, and Israel and Jordan in their peace agreement, and there are 2 peace agreements with Israel and these 2 neighbors from 1979 and 1994, if I remember correctly, more or less accepted the armistice lines as their final borders. In other words, the armistice lines did eventually not compel, but induce acceptance as final borders in any peace deal. So in other words, there is importance to the armistice lines, even though in the armistice agreements it says these are not the final lines.
But was this acceptance enshrouded in international law so as...
I don't know international law.
In violation of international law?
No, international law doesn't apply, as far as I know, and I don't know how important international law anyhow is in conflicts, and I know nothing about international law, but as far as I know, there is no determination in international law that crossing or violating these borders is a violation of international law. I don't know that. What there is a determination through various Geneva Conventions that settlement in occupied territories, which is of course beyond those lines determined in the armistice agreements, is illegal. That is, it's forbidden, and therefore it's illegal in Geneva Conventions, which have been accepted by the United Nations. So in that sense, there's a violation of the line, but it's not in terms of a future peace agreement that these lines are sacrosanct or not, or violating law or not, international law or not. It's to do with settlement, the problem here, as far as I know.
Thank you. The question is the same as Anna and earlier, the same about the religious motivations on the conflict. I don't want to squeeze you on it. But in my opinion, the first war, Palestinian War, 48, much more political and secular motivations than religious motivations. Concerning it was much more a sort of ethnic or Arab nationalistic motivations than religious. But to talk about religious motivations, first, I would like to ask you what were the religious motivations concerning the Arabs, and second, then in after the 60s and the 70s, in the 80s, because we should bear in mind that, for instance, the leadership, George Abbas or Arafat, they were not Muslims, at least. They were not, George Abbas was an atheist, at least. They were secular. George Abbas.
Habash, yeah, but Habash is relatively unimportant.
Was a secular.
Yeah. A Marxist, yeah, whatever.
Marxist,
yeah.
We can argue the difference between Marxism and religion. That's another question. And then suddenly in the 80s, you had a sort of Islamization of the conflict, mostly with Hamas with the first Intifada in 87. So my point is, first question, what were the religious motivations in the beginning, first? Second question, how do you justify the Islamization or jihadization of the conflict in the late 80s and then the 90s and 2001? Of course, you can say the influence of Hamas, but why was that influence? Why there wasn't? Why the religious motivation increased during that time? So
the religious, No. Can I answer that?
It's connected to this. Could you, when he says the religious motivations of the Muslims, could you talk about the religious motivations of the Jews also?
Okay.
Thank you.
Look, the religious motivation or the upsurge in the Islamic content in the conflict on the Arab side, I think is a reflection and part of the growing Islamization of the Arab world. And this has stemmed from various reasons. The triggers for it, without doubt, are the takeover in Iran of the Islamists and the attack on the big mosque in Mecca, which failed, but nonetheless brought to a head the increased Islamic sensibilities in Saudi Arabia. Both these things triggered a growing Islamization of the Arab world. That's without doubt. And this included the Palestinians, which partly explains why Palestinians were swept up in it and Hamas became more important in the conflict. Because before the 70s, Hamas was a very small organization, relatively it wasn't called Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhood was a small organization in Palestine. Look, the religious motivations are that, well, the most basic is that any land conquered by Islam, which becomes part of Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, cannot be given up, shouldn't be given up and allowed to be taken over by infidels, which then turns it again into Dar al-Harb, which becomes the area of conflict. Or, in other words, Muslims should not allow lands that they once possessed to revert to non-Muslim possession. That's a basic creed in which most Muslim factions, as far as I know, believe. That is, over the centuries, they've said that. And this applies to Palestine now and applied in the past, and you'll occasionally hear echoes of it in regard to Andalus or Spain, which used to belong to Muslims and now is Christian, and some people still talk about it like bin Laden, that we have to get that back also. But in the wider Muslim outlook, by Islamists, they believe that the world should become Muslim, not just the lands they've lost, which of course have to become again Muslim, but the whole world should eventually turn to the right religion, which is Islam, and Allah, and accept Allah. That includes, of course, Palestine as well. So those are two levels of motivation, of religious motivation. I would add to that there are specific religious sites in Palestine which are very important to Muslims, which shouldn't be under infidel control, and that includes the sites on the Temple Mount. Jerusalem has always been sort of unimportant in Muslim history unless it's taken by an infidel. In other words, Jerusalem, the word Jerusalem, Al-Quds or whatever, some other phrase, isn't mentioned in the Quran at all. It's not important. But when it's taken over by the Crusaders at the end of the 11th century, it suddenly becomes crucial to Islam. And this applies again to these holy sites, which are under effective Israeli sovereignty at the moment, infidel sovereignty.
So just, Rami has the next question, but I'll just say very briefly.
But you're not addressing.
Yes, you asked about Jewish. Look, I did address, it's not I didn't address, I talked about it in relation to 1948. And what I said was, there were very few religious Jews in Palestine in 48, and they were, as a community, very unimportant. Some of them were anti-Zionist, and those who were Zionist remained unimportant in the Jewish Zionist establishment. They didn't control any of the levers of power: the foreign ministry, the prime minister, defense minister, the army, the Shin Bet, the Haganah intelligence service, which breaks up into Shin Bet and Mossad. None of these religious people had no connection to these places. None at all. None of the generals, none of the colonels were religious. And none of the ministers, except for one or two ministers, but not in important ministries in terms of warfare with the Arab states. So in 48, the war is not waged as a religious war by the Jews. What you can say is that since 48, demographically, Israel has changed, and there are more and more religious people, and they occupy more and more important places in Israeli coalitions, and therefore in cabinets, government cabinets, and have more say in what happens. And there is, among those religious people, religious motivation is important. The settlers in the West Bank, many of whom are religious, are motivated by their religious beliefs to settle there and to want the whole land of Israel, because that was God-given in their eyes and belongs to the Jews, not to the Arabs. But that's a change which has occurred gradually since 49 to this day.
But there was no belief that the land was God-given prior.
I answered that. I told you that most Jews did not accept that, because most Jews were irreligious.
Most Jews rejected the idea that
they didn't have to reject it. This wasn't the basis of their claim to the land. That's what you're saying. What is their claim to the land? What they said is, that's not our claim. Our claim to the land of Israel, Palestine, is that this was the traditional home of the Jews. This was the land of the Jews. This is where Judaism emerged. This is the land we once ruled until thrown out by various conquerors from the Romans onwards, and usurped by Arabs who sort of poured out of the desert and came to settle there. The Arabs never lived there. People who spoke Arabic and prayed to Allah, there was no such thing in Palestine before the 7th century.
But isn't that a biblical idea?
It's not biblical, it's post-biblical. No, the Bible doesn't refer to the 7th century.
But if they're living there,
what?
And you said before they were put out,
yes.
And this whole idea of...
It's not biblical, it's a matter of nationalism. We as a people once lived and owned this land. Conquerors came and took the land from us and eventually ejected us, but we would like to return to that land. It's got nothing to do with God.
By the way, the early Zionists
were anti-religious.
Anti-religious, and Israel wasn't sometimes even on
So
the map.
I'm gonna hold it there. No, excuse me. I'm gonna take the prerogative of the chair. This is a layer, a very important.
When you talk about this,
yeah,
it's very swapping now.
It's a very important layer. Agreed. But we're going to focus on the subject matter. I'm just going to say, I think also what's important in terms of jihad. No, we have 2 weeks of this.
He should be from the Middle East to can understand what's the value of the land for the people there.
Harold,
it's something related to the culture, by the way.
It's a very important layer. And it will be
and to French peasants
be a part of
and German peasants. Land is important.
The land is honored.
Now we have another.
You're sorry.
So I just want to say, in terms of going back to the notion of jihad, it's also interesting in terms of Islamism that the Jews are the only non-Muslims with self-determination on holy Islamic land. And I think that plays a role. I also want to mention that Bassam is here and he's going to speak about jihad. And Femi Van, who will be here next week, who is an expert on West African history, Harold, will speak about the three waves of Islam and how Islam, the third wave of Islam, played a crucial role in slave trade and in colonialism, and sort of the British relations with the Emirates in West Africa. So there's a lot that there's layers of the conversations that will continue. So next we have Rami, then Giuseppe, and then Sunni.
The question is from Samahid, not from me.
Well, why don't you ask your own question?
I'm translating.
I'm joking.
I'm familiar with this issue. So, Sam, I want to ask one question from 1 million words, but I will do my best to summarize it as much as I can. The first part, he talking about in books and writers of the Muslim Brotherhood, they claim they were played a very important role inside the 48 war as a kind of jihad, military. But at the same time, there is many Egyptian scholars. One of them is Helmi al-Nimnim. He served as a Minister of Culture. He denied completely any role for the Muslim Brotherhood inside this war. That is number one. Number two, Sam, I wanted to understand from your side, because you are Israeli, you are Jew. Do you believe that it's a war between Israeli and Muslim, between two quotation Arab countries, give a credit to Islamists in the Arab country to get more popularity on the street? That's all. Thank you.
Well, as to the last question, no doubt, Islamists appeal to crowds and tell them that we're the ones who are waging the war or want to wage the war against the infidel Jews who've settled here, and this attracts voters. This makes them popular. Without doubt, this has been exploited by the Muslim Brotherhood, certainly was in 48, 47, 48, during the 48 war, and probably since in various places. As to the question about the Muslim Brotherhood and the war itself, the Muslim Brotherhood did participate in small measure in the 48 war. I mentioned before the Arab Liberation Army, which was set up by the Arab League at the end of 1947 and entered with 4,000 troops, entered the country and fought alongside the Palestinian militias, not very successfully. In addition to the Arab Liberation Army, there were other foreign contingents who joined the war. There were volunteers who came from Saudi Arabia, from Sudan, from Yemen, but there was also a contingent of Egyptian Muslim brothers who joined the fighting. No, he wasn't there. I don't think so. Well, he may say he was there. I've never seen any evidence that he was there. But they raised volunteers. The Muslim Brothers raised volunteers from among their own people and subsidized several companies of volunteers from the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood who entered the Negev, southern Palestine, and fought alongside Palestinians against the Israelis before 48. And after 48, they sort of were appended to the Egyptian army as special companies, and they were sent basically to the eastern arm of the Egyptian advance, which was through Beersheba, Hebron, Bethlehem, towards Jerusalem. So there were several companies of Muslim brothers who were fighting in Palestine from more or less March 1948 in the civil war, and as I say, later as part of the Egyptian army after the Egyptian invasion of the 15th of May. Their role wasn't very important and wasn't very significant, and they weren't large numbers. There was an attempt by the Muslim Brotherhood to get volunteers to come in larger numbers, in line with the fatwa of Al-Azhar and other fatwas of the same kind, to join the war from afar. And there were people from North Africa, Maghreb, that is Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, who tried to get to the war, and some of them did actually join the war. Some Moroccans did fight in the war in 48, but most were stopped by the British. Most of these volunteers from North Africa were stopped by the British and interned by the British in Egypt, because the British weren't interested in a flood of people crossing across British-controlled Egypt and reaching Palestine, and God knows doing what sort of harm. Also the British control in Egypt, so they interned them and eventually sent most of them back to North Africa.
But do you see Brotherhood exactly?
Sorry?
Played an important role? Or
I would say it's an insignificant role.
Okay.
There weren't that many of them, and they didn't accomplish very much. They tried to conquer Kibbutz Negba. There was one village, one Jewish settlement they attacked and were unsuccessful in doing it, and that was their major contribution, apart from, as I say, being an auxiliary of the Egyptian army. I don't know what evidence there is that Hassan al-Banna was actually in Palestine. Well, that Arafat says he was born to God knows where and what, but that doesn't mean anything.
We can take him seriously. Okay, thank you.
And that he says he was there.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Giuseppe.
Thanks so very much for this fascinating lecture, and especially for shining light on the religious dimension. I will not add many things because many things have already been said. Just 2 points. One point, there were also a contingent of Egyptian Sufis inspired by the Azamiya, and the leader of the Azamiya, as early as 1917, has issued a fatwa preventing any Muslim from selling land to
Jews. Yeah.
So the religious motivation was clear from many points of view. But there is maybe a secondary jihad, that is the one of some Christian Arab leaders. The lady that you mentioned, but also in Egypt, for instance, the church was mostly supportive of war against Israel, and to such an extent that in the 70s, after the peace treaty, the Pope was against the peace treaty and Sadat dismissed it. So
the Coptic Pope.
Yeah, the Coptic Pope. So
yeah.
I wanted to know if you have explored also this side of the...
I haven't.
That's an interesting subject.
It's an interesting subject. I haven't explored it now.
So thanks. So Valerie and then Sue.
As everyone has said, thank you so much. And I'm coming very new to the subject matter. So one of the questions you already touched on about kind of where Saudi Arabia kind of fits in supporting or not supporting. But I also wanted to know, was there any kind of support from the Ethiopian Jews or folks who identify as Jewish who are also of African descent in the conflict?
You know what? I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about Jews or so-called Jews in Ethiopia, and there's different types. Some are real, apparently real Jews, and some are sort of family members of people who are Jews. It's not that clear, the distinction between these two groups. I don't know anything about what they thought about 48. I don't know if they were conscious of the war. They lived in sort of primitive villages. They didn't have newspapers. They didn't know what was going on, I assume. So I don't know what they knew and what they supported. I have no idea. They didn't start coming to Israel until the late 1970s, as far as I remember.
So I'd say two things. There's a scholar named Edith Bruder who looks at the Jewish African diaspora, history, politics, and identities. She's from the Sorbonne, and she teaches a course in SOAS in the University of London. She does very good work. And there's some good scholars, and I think there was an African presence, an African Jewish presence in Israel longer than 1970s. And
yeah?
Yeah, it's a long
okay.
history. And the first time we were called Jews was in Africa. That's another story. Okay. Sue.
Oh yes, I appreciate what you were talking about when you mentioned the fact that extreme Islamic fundamentalism is dangerous to everyone, specifically Muslims, as you see with ISIL. And so my question is, when I'm in front of social science teachers who go into the high school, the question that high school students ask in the States is, will there ever be peace in the Middle East? And do you yourself ever see a two-state solution happening?
Well, look, I know a little bit about the past. I don't know very much about the future, and that's what you're asking about. So I know as much as you. I mean, I'm pessimistic. But I'm not. I don't know anything about it. What the future looks like.
There's a Leonard Cohen song called "The Future." Tyrone. It's a good song. Leonard Cohen, "The Future." It's a great song. If anybody wants, I'm serious now. There's a song by Leonard Cohen called "The Future." Read the lyrics. It's brilliant, and it's all about this.
All about that.
Yeah.
Ah, yeah. I'm not aware of that. Okay.
So my question was about the war and like the outcome of it. So considering
I'm sorry, can you start again so we can hear you?
my question was about the war and the outcome of the war between the Arabs and the Jews. Considering the Jews were able to win the war, considering they were able to win the war, were they able to have like power to control like who would live where, or is that something that was still decided by the UN? Considering they came up with the plan, the two-state plan, or is that something that was resolved by the UN, the two states at the end of the war?
Well, the war ended in essentially a political victory by the Israelis, meaning they established their state and were able to maintain their state. And as a sovereign state, they were able to control the populations which lived in the state, meaning Jews and Jews who were immigrating to Israel and the Arabs who lived there. And Jews immigrating to Israel, many of them were sent to live in various settlements in areas which had been evacuated by Israel, by Arabs, and along borders which had just been formed. Israeli Arabs were placed under military control in Israel until 1966. I think there was a military government which controlled where Arabs could live and move. If Arabs lived in certain places, they were allowed to stay there, which became the Israeli Arab minority. They were allowed to stay where they lived and they got Israeli citizenship, but they weren't allowed free movement between places until 1966. But they were considered a potential fifth column, a potential enemy. When it became clear after... To many Israelis, it became clear earlier, but to the government, it became clear by 1966 that they were loyal citizens and able to become normal citizens in the country. And a military government was removed, and they enjoyed rights of movement and settlement, etc., as they wished. That's in short. I don't know if that answers what you were asking, but that's in short. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So Holly and then Rafi. And also, if people have their phone ringers on, like bings and things, if you can put them on vibrate or silent, I think many of us would appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, someone had mentioned like the Coptic Church, it's not quite related, but similarly lends the Christian perspective. First, what was the percentage of Palestinian Christians
of
the 1948 war, and where did they fall into believing what their leaders were telling them about the situation?
The whole subject is interesting, and there are researchers working on Palestinian Arab Christians. The Palestinian Arab population, 1.2, 1.3 million in 1947, was 90% Muslim and 10% Christian. When 700,000 Palestinians were uprooted from their homes and moved to other parts of Palestine or out, more stayed, that is, of the Palestinians living in Palestine in areas taken over by the Jews. Christians tended to want to stay rather than leave, and more of them stayed proportionately than Muslims. In other words, so the proportion of Christians among the Arabs living in Israel grew in the areas which became Israel. But gradually that proportion was overtaken by Muslim Arab birth rates, which were much higher than Christian Arab birth rates. So today you don't find that many Christians among Israel's Arabs, and the proportion of Christians in the West Bank and Gaza has declined even more because they're under pressure from their Muslim neighbors. They don't really want to live among Muslims, and under this pressure in other countries where there's a Muslim majority and a Christian minority, they're persecuted, as happens in Egypt. So the numbers of Christians in the West Bank and Gaza has been declining, and places like Bethlehem, which used to be majority Christian towns, are now majority Muslim towns. The Christians have always been placed in a difficult situation throughout the conflict because Arabs distrusted them and thought that they would make common cause with the Jews, certainly common cause with the British occupiers who were Christians. And the British, of course, favored the Christian Arabs over the Muslim Arabs, being fellow Christians. There were some Christians, prominent among them George Habash or Wadia Haddad, people like that who tried to say we're more Catholic than the Pope, we're more Arab than your Muslim Arab, to show that they were real loyal Arabs, loyal to the nationalist Arab cause. So you do find that among Christians as well. But basically I think they've always suffered from a sense, a fear of their Muslim neighbors, which they can't announce publicly. They can't say that publicly. That'll stir, of course, Muslim anger. But it has existed, and you feel among Christians in Israel today, Christian Arabs, there is voluntarism to the IDF. In growing numbers, young Christians are going to serve in the army, in the Israeli army. It may be partly to do with economic problems, you can't find a job. It may also be a sign of loyalty to the Jewish state and fear of Muslims as well.
Benny, I want you to address one particular issue that until now you did not mention. You did say that there were some commanders on the ground that took initiative on their own. There was no higher command to make the Arabs leave. We do know that more than 90% of the Israeli army, first was Haganah, then the Israeli army, more than 90% were Haganah forces. And there are small units of Etzel and if you try to locate, maybe you did it, of the incidents in which commanders, local commanders on the ground took this kind of initiative, can you say something about their affiliation with the Haganah, Etzel, or Lehi? Is it something that
It's a complicated subject. Look, the IDF is based essentially on was based on the Haganah. The Haganah changed its name to the IDF. In the course of the summer of 1948, in the course of the summer of 1948, I'll explain in a second. Members of the IZL, which was British called the Irgun, and members of the LHI, which the British called the Stern Gang, were inducted into the IDF in the summer of 1948. In the 1930s and 40s, there was the Haganah, and alongside it were two small paramilitary organizations, which the British and the Haganah usually call terrorist organizations, affiliated to the right wing of the Zionist movement. One was the IZL, and from it sprang another one called the LHI, or the Stern Gang. But they were very small. By 1947, there were probably 2,000 members in the IZL, maybe a little more, and the LHI had several hundred members. So we're talking about very small organizations compared to the 30,000 members in the Haganah, which had become the IDF. These organizations vanished in the summer of 1948 when they were inducted into the IDF. When there were atrocities in certain places, and like in a place called Duema in the south, Haganah people accused the battalion which had carried out the atrocity of having a large number of LHI members. That's why they did it. But this is nonsense, because Haganah people also committed atrocities, probably in larger numbers. So the most famous atrocity in 48, which is remembered, is Dir Yassin, which was actually committed by the LHI and by IZL forces on the 9th of April 1948. But subsequently, basically, atrocities were committed by ex-Haganah IDF personnel, if that's what you're asking.
I asked about explosions?
No, the LHI and the IZL were unimportant, and they were inducted into the army, so they didn't carry out expulsions. Because they were, if they were members of the LHI and a unit which committed expulsions, they were just members. The people who commanded the expulsion were IDF Haganah people. The whole of the IDF was commanded by the Haganah. IZL and LHI people were never given high positions in the Haganah.
One more question, not related, well, somewhat related, but not really related. During the Second World War, we had a distinguished person here in this country. His name is Ken Livingstone, former mayor of London, activist in the Labour Party. I think now.
He didn't fight in 48.
No.
I'm joking. Okay.
Livingstone.
Yeah.
Livingstone spoke about relationship connections between Lehi people and Hitler and the Nazis. Can you say something? Do you know something about that?
Yeah, he wasn't the first to write about it. Israeli historians have written about that connection. When World War II broke out, 1939, the Haganah said, the war is being fought between the British, who are persecuting the Jews a bit in Palestine, but being fought by the British against Hitler, who's an anti-Semite and wants to destroy the Jews, maybe. So the Haganah came out, and the Jewish establishment in Palestine came out in favor of supporting the British Empire in World War II, and that's how it stayed. The Haganah and the mainstream of the Jews, they were joined by the ISGAP, later led by Menachem Begin, who said also, essentially, these are our real enemies today. The enemies of the Jewish people are the Nazis. The British are fighting the Nazis. We'll join the British, even though the British are busy suppressing Jewish nationalism in Palestine. And that's what happened until 1944. The ISGAP continued to support the British in the war. In 1944, the ISGAP, then under Menachem Begin, said, well, the British have essentially won the war. It's a matter of months, as it was. 1944, we'll renew our campaign to get the British out of Palestine. Now, before that, in 1940, the LHI, which emerged as a breakaway group from the ISGAP. 1940, the ISGAP supports the British war effort. Some members in the ISGAP say, no, we mustn't. The British are still suppressing us in Palestine and not supporting Jewish statehood in Palestine. We will break away and continue to fight against the British, even though the British are fighting the Germans. In fact, we'll even go to the Germans. This is before the actual Holocaust begins, because the Holocaust begins in 1941. They're busy doing things against Jews before, but it's not that clear that they're out to destroy the Jewish people. So some LHI people say, well, let's continue to fight the British and try and get the Germans to help us fight the British by getting some money, getting arms from the Germans and so on. And they send some agents, in fact, to Turkey to meet up with local German intelligence agents and maybe to get the Germans to support us in our continuing fight against the British in Palestine. It's all a bit complicated, but essentially nothing comes of it. The Germans are interested in helping this faction of Jews or another faction of Jews, and nothing comes of it. But there are these efforts by the LHI before the Holocaust officially begins to obtain German support to continue the fight against the British.
So what year was that?
1940.
Yeah, if I might, I want to respond to Valerie's question. My wife is Ethiopian Jewish, so I might be able to speak to this, but they have a long and documented history that extends back centuries and millennia. And they were, and by the way, their Judaism is recognized by the rabbinate in Israel as actually and not so-called.
No. Let me add to that. Some Ethiopians are recognized as Jews. There are also others who are not recognized as Jews who claim they're Jews or are by family connections connected to Jews. Those are the ones I called so-called. The actual Jews, Ethiopian Jews, as you say, were recognized by the Israeli rabbinate as Jews, and that puts an end to that.
Yeah. And so they endured persecution for their Judaism throughout the ages, just as Jewish groups from all over the world. And as a result of that persecution, they also longed to be reconstituted in their homeland. In Israel, there was a holiday that was developed from that called SIG that is actually recognized in Israel as a national holiday. And they're very loyal to the state of Israel, and many of them are aligned more with the political right in Israel, with Likud. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion.
And also, as a point, falasha in Amharic means foreigner.
It means the others.
The others, yeah.
Foreigner, others, yeah. So it's pejorative, and so even though they've been there for thousands of years and have history, they were still considered other.
Yeah.
Okay. Avram.
You said that the Jews in Iraq were expelled by their neighbors, like the neighbor
were intimidated into flight.
According to the stories of my parents and my uncle, the representative of the government in Iraq came to the village and told them that they have 24 hours, and they had a great relation with the neighbors, so it was maybe because it's Kurdistan, so it's a little bit different. But the government was very...
Okay, so you're saying in fact they were ordered out.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about on the national level, there was never a declaration of expulsion. Maybe you're right that officials in local localities came to Jews and said, get out. That's what I mean by intimidation. Yeah, okay.
Is there evidence of the participation of German officers on the Arab
side in this war? And also, I read reports about the involvement of Bosnian Muslims. And is there in essence anything?
Okay, Bosnian Muslims did volunteer in certain numbers. Nobody knows how many. At the time, somebody spoke of hundreds, maybe it was only tens, but there were Bosnian Muslims who joined the Palestinian militias in the war, in the civil war part of the war. And some of them were killed, and they found evidence, ID cards or something that they're Bosnians. So that's proven. There were rumors, and maybe more than rumors, that there were German officers helping the Palestinians, training them, teaching them how to make explosives in the Palestinian militias in that civil war part of the war. And some were reportedly killed, and I've seen the names of these people, but I've never actually seen evidence that they were Germans there. In other words, the Israeli Zionist intelligence, Haganah intelligence, did identify the existence of these guys, even the names of some of them. We're talking about a dozen people, and a dozen Germans perhaps, serving in the ranks of the Palestinian militias, but I've never actually seen hard proof that there were some there. I've just seen evidence that the Zionist intelligence believed that there were some. There were German advisors in the Egyptian and Syrian armies in the 48 war. That we know, that they were trying to train them, ex-Wehrmacht officers who knew the work and helped train after the British had left and the French had left, helped train Syrians and Egyptians. We also know of the presence of Poles, and some Poles would, for mercenary reasons, the Arabs were paying a lot of money for foreign volunteers, as incidentally the Israelis were. A lot of people who came to serve in the Israeli army from abroad, and there were such volunteers. Some of them were Jews and some were Christians, and they were given high wages, pilots and people like that. So the Arabs did the same thing, and there apparently were some Poles also who joined the Arab war effort. But we're talking about a handful, not numbers, real numbers.
Kurt Waldheim served in Bosnia?
I don't know. Kurt Waldheim was a Nazi, an Austrian Nazi, and he seems to have killed people in the area of Yugoslavia during World War II as a Nazi. Yeah.
And
what? Maybe in Greece as well. Yeah.
And also, there's been now reports emerging in 1975 when the United Nations passed that Zionism is racism under Kurt Waldheim. He had a party at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. Anyway. Okay, we have Adi and then Carlton. No, I'm being serious.
Maybe he was celebrating somebody's birthday.
But the guest list was odd.
Okay.
They weren't his cousins.
Okay.
Maybe they were.
Just a quick about that. There's a very good documentary about Waldheim's services.
Yes.
Right now, running an Austrian film. I wanted to ask you regarding the intention of the Arab side. You said that we can't really ascertain or know because there's a lack of documentation. I wanted to ask you, how do you relate, there was an Iraqi inquiry, and I read there that the Safwat, who was the chief of staff of the commander of Arabs' attempt to do some kind of coordinated attack.
He was the head of a military committee in Damascus, which was trying to coordinate the Arab war effort against the Zionists in Palestine.
And there I read that when he says the aims of the war, number one is either, it's not kill the Jews, but it's basically kill the state of Israel. So I don't remember the words exactly, but...
I also don't remember the words exactly. No, I've seen the reports. Look, I think it's even...
It's in the book.
Yes, it's in the book. There's an Hebrew translation of... What you're talking about is an Iraqi parliamentary inquiry. After the war, most of the Arabs stayed out. Most Arab governments, the subject of the 48 war was taboo. They wouldn't touch it. It was a great defeat, humiliating. Nobody wanted to talk about it. The Iraqi parliament, for some reason, was able to establish a commission of inquiry into why the Arabs had lost the war. And this guy, Safwat, figures in that commission of inquiry because he was an Iraqi general who had participated in trying to coordinate the Arab war effort and wrote various reports. I don't remember that he said that the effort was to destroy the Zionist presence. I don't remember how it's phrased.
It's quite clear.
Okay, I just don't remember. You've caught me about...
My question is whether this is something that you think represents other people, or was it just like bragging or?
I don't remember the context or the phrase itself, so I can't answer that. I just don't remember.
Okay.
I do remember quite a lot, but that I don't remember. Yeah.
Okay, so Carlton, and if anybody else wants to ask a question, please motion to me.
We can finish early also.
Carlton.
Finish early.
Thank you. Vinny, it's always wonderful hearing you, and so I want to thank you, first of all, for your talk. A lot of times when I'm listening to the talks here and elsewhere, but especially here, I try to transport myself back to the States, especially where I deal with a lot of historically black colleges and universities. I deal with others as well. So I try to imagine transporting you into those contexts and what the responses of these very, very thoughtful, critical, and engaged students might have to say or might have to ask with regard to what they hear. So, and couple that briefly, and I'll be quick, with my own research interest, which is the rhetoric around quote-unquote race, right? The rhetoric around it in Britain, especially in Britain and the United States. So all that leads to this one question. At one point when the conversation came to the idea of blacks who are Jewish or blacks or Ethiopian Jews, I think I heard the word primitive with regard to their conditions.
Yes, the condition of the villages. It's a politically incorrect word, but we all understand what it means.
Well, not always. So I think that
we do. They don't.
Be very explicit for the student if I can.
Yeah.
And I had the same response when I was taking a Russian course on Russian history, right? And the professor would say, well, there was a certain time, in Tsarist Russia, there was a backward people. And people started saying, well, what do you mean backward? He meant, no, we're looking backward in history. But we have to ferret out this language and be clear, I think, so that all those old colonial notions of superiority and hegemony don't reign in.
Let me answer.
That frees us up.
I mentioned primitive villages, and I meant primitive conditions of life. If you don't have electricity, you don't have running water, those are primitive conditions. I'm not talking about the people themselves, I'm talking about the areas. And that's what I referred to as far as I remember. And that was the situation of most Jews in Ethiopia over the centuries, like other peasants living in Ethiopia. And that's all I used and meant.
Yes, and so I'm just saying that I just introduced that as part of our conversation of things that can be live wires.
Okay.
And could either engage or turn off.
You're saying to avoid the use of words like that. That's what you're saying.
My area is,
okay.
that is my area. So
okay.
That's why I'm very sensitive to it. That I want us to think about that. And
okay.
Thank you.
All right. The first one is, well, let me just get to my first question.
I have to go through.
I want to follow Carl, because I'm glad the rabbis here, because maybe he can help me with this.
It's late.
I am very intrigued with your distinction, or shall I say juxtaposition, where you're willing to separate Zionism from any kind of religious ideology or any kind of religious underpinning. I find that very fascinating because Zionism assumes one of the necessary preconditions for Zionism is this belief that there is some kind of homeland for us. And I would argue that even the whole idea of homeland has another further philosophical precommitment. And that would mean that somehow or another there was some land that we got, or some land, some place that we inherited. I'm having difficulty moving away from or disconnecting.
Not necessarily.
Hold tight. Well, hold on, I'll talk to you in a second. I'm having a problem disconnecting the Abraham story and the story of Israel and the story of the Davidic Empire from this tradition about
homeland. Okay, let me.
And then that goes back to the source of this tradition being the Bible.
Yeah.
And therefore, when I start, that makes me again put religion back on the table.
Okay.
So help me understand how you.
I'm not sure I can, but what I would say, I'm not sure I can, but what I would say is this, is Native American tribes, I don't know if the word tribe is politically correct, but nation, okay. Wait a second.
You all right, man, go fix it.
Okay. Wait, one second. They regard patches of territory in America, in the United States. They regard patches of territory in the United States and in Canada as their homeland. I don't know if that has a religious connection or not, but in that sense, why did they regard it as homeland? Because their tribe has lived there or had lived there from time immemorial, as far as they're concerned. The same applies to the Jews. I don't think it's necessarily connected to God. You're right, the Bible is also a religious book, but it's also a book of history. And the Zionist movement regarded the book as a book of history, the history of our people, not as a religious document, though I understood that religious Jews regarded it as a religious document, but for them it was a book of history, of the history of their people and their connection to this piece of land which had once been inhabited and ruled by Jews. That's what it's about. Better than that, I don't think I can explain it.
Okay, now we can have a conversation about the historicity of those texts. Let you and I talk over lunch, all right? Let's talk.
Well, I'm not gonna be here for lunch, and we have to finish. We do have to finish.
As chairing the session, I'll leave
Okay,
one
well,
question. Where is your homeland, and how do you justify it?
That's a great
That
question.
will have let's have lunch. Let's have lunch.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you right now. Ready to go right
That
now?
was a rhetorical question.
Ready to go right now. I appreciate you. Choose your weapon. Let's get it on.
All right. So on that note, thank you.
My pleasure.